Chapter 35. Fire! Jack screamed the command. He did not care that he stood in the line of redcoats as a private soldier. He had to rectify Dutton's dreadful error if they were to stand any chance of survival. The men of the 24th looked up in surprise as the strange voice shouted the order. Fire! Now! Jack twisted on the spot, bellowing the command for all he was worth. He was roundly ignored. He saw Dutton's head snap around, a look of shocked surprise on his face as he heard Jack's desperate order. For a fleeting moment he caught Jack's eye, before turning back, his bottom lip reaching up to chew on his thick moustache. Jack felt a hand clap hard onto his shoulder. Shut your mouth. Corporal Jones had been ordered to stand watch over the charlatan in the ranks of the 24th. But there was little force in his warning to be silent. He too was staring in horror at the enemy horde racing towards them. Jack was not the only one sensing that the officers were about to commit a terrible mistake. Jack shook off the warning hand. He pulled his musket back into his shoulder and squinted down the sight. The enemy horsemen were dreadfully close, surely no more than 50 yards away from the redcoats' fragile formation, and closing fast. There was no time left. He pulled the trigger. He felt the kick of the musket as it fired, the stock punching hard into his shoulder. Fire! He screamed the command as the crisp cough of his shot died away. For a single dreadful heartbeat there was silence. Oh, fuck it. Corporal Jones muttered the oath under his breath before sucking in a lungful of the scorching air. 24th! Fire! This time the redcoats responded. Jack caught a glimpse of the shock on Kingsley's face as his command opened fire without orders, before the cloud of foul-smelling powder smoke rolled back over the line and hid him from view. At such close range, the effect of the volley was terrible. Those enemy horsemen charging the 24th were scythed down, the head of the charge gutted by the deadly accurate musket fire. The heavy balls punched through the flesh of man and beast, killing and maiming indiscriminately. Men shrieked as they were torn apart, adding to the inhuman cries of the horses. More riders and horses went down as they collided with those struck by the close-range fire, the front half of the charging horde reduced to chaos in a heartbeat. Reload! Colour Sergeant Hughes bellowed the command, taking over the orders that Kingsley should have been delivering. The 24th had taken the bit between the teeth, fighting and killing without command, saving themselves as their officers looked on. Dutton nearly fell from the saddle when the 24th's volley roared out. Damn you! Not yet! The Major pulled hard on his reins, wheeling his horse around as he shouted in anger. Proudfoot kicked his own horse forward, his face twisted in a snarl of recrimination. You fool! That was Lark! He snapped the words with anger. But Dutton was no longer looking towards the 24th. Instead, he was staring in horror at the horde of enemy horsemen thundering towards them. Oh, God! The colour fled from his florid face as the full weight of his error struck him. Proudfoot looked aghast at the commander of his native troops before turning to see just what had caused the Major such utter dismay. The horde of horsemen were no more than 20 yards away. The speed of their advance was mesmerising. They were tearing across the ground, covering the dusty soil far faster than either man would have believed possible. Fire! Dutton screamed the command to his own troops, his terror-given voice. The roar of the sepoys' volley thundered out, the 300 muskets firing in unison. The wave of sound slammed down the valley an instant after the storm of musket balls drove into the enemy horde. The volley ripped the leading ranks apart. The riders at the front of the charging cavalry were butchered, the bodies of both man and horse torn apart at such close range. Yet the momentum of the charge was irresistible. Even as they died, the leading riders slammed into the sepoys' ranks in the thin red line, tearing huge gaps all along its length. Sepoys went down, limbs twisted and broken by the weight of the dead horses and riders, their terrified shouts cut off as they were struck to the ground. Behind the gutted ranks, dozens of the Maharajah's irregular cavalry thundered into the dead and dying, their shouts of warning replacing the dreadful keening for blood. Many were thrown to the ground, unable to stop in time, adding to the chaos. Other riders, untouched by the volley, plunged into the maelstrom, forcing their terrified horses through the blood and the confusion. Free from the melee, they gouged their spurs back, throwing their mounts into the gaps that had been torn in the sepoys' ranks, their tulwars flashing bright in the harsh sunlight as they slashed at the heads of the stunned redcoats, who suddenly found themselves easy targets for the surviving horsemen. Major Proudfoot watched in growing horror as he saw Dutton's men reduced to a broken rabble in no more than a dozen heartbeats. "Arthur, with me!" he shouted across to Lieutenant Fenris, who was staring in amazement as the British line was torn to shreds before his eyes. "Ride, man!" He didn't wait to see if his new aide-de-camp heard him. He put his spurs to his horse's flanks, turning its head and urging it into a gallop. He would not wait to bear witness to the destruction of his redcoats. Jack flinched as the sepoys' volley roared out. Ahead of him, the 24th's own volley had bludgeoned the enemy horsemen to a halt, the power of their musket fire smashing the charge into bloody confusion. He could see riders trying to pick their way through the carnage, but it would take time for them to get past the gruesome obstacle. Around him, the redcoats reloaded their weapons, their hands moving in haste as they strove to be ready before enough of the enemy riders could break free and once again threaten the frail line. It had been only a matter of seconds between the 24th's volley and that of the native soldiers in the 12th, but already the sepoys were broken. Those left standing huddled together, desperate to find safety with their fellows. The merciless horsemen swarmed around these small islands, leaning down from their saddles, slashing and thrusting their vicious sabres. With their flank no longer protected, the 24th was in dreadful danger. They had butchered the riders who had sought to charge them, but if they stayed in line, they stood no hope. "Colour Sergeant Hughes!" Jack's voice was huge. "Form square!" The tall colour sergeant heard the command. He glanced around for his captain, but Kingsley still stood mute on the company's right flank, staring in rapt horror at the destruction Jack had ordered. "Now, damn it! Form square!" Jack repeated his command. This time the colour sergeant did not hesitate. "Company, form square!" The redcoats knew their business. The company would reform into square, each flank 3 ranks deep. The formation would bristle with bayonets, a wall of steel that no horse would be able to penetrate. If they could form it in time, and if they remained steady, then they would be safe from the marauding cavalry. Colour Sergeant Hughes' command was still echoing around the confined valley when the men of the 24th started to move. With their corporals acting as marshals on the pivot points, the flanks of the square quickly started to form. Ignoring the chaos to their left, the 24th manoeuvred to save itself from destruction. "What the devil do you think you're doing?" Jack's shoulder was yanked backwards and he spun round on the spot to face a furious Captain Kingsley. "Saving your bloody command," Jack snapped back, his anger flaring. Around them the square was nearly fully formed, the sergeants and corporals bustling round, positioning their charges to ensure that each of the 4 flanks was properly aligned. "Fix bayonets!" Colour Sergeant Hughes had moved to the centre of the square, taking command as his officer chose to confront the man who had just saved them from certain destruction. "You bastard! Spittle was flung from Kingsley's lips as he damned Jack. "These are my men. Mine. Do you hear me?" Jack glanced through the side of the square nearest the slaughtered horsemen. Already many of the enemy had picked their way through the grotesque barrier, and in moments the 24th would be under attack. There was no time to waste. Jack did the only thing he could think of. He snapped his fist forwards, punching Kingsley square on the point of his chin. The captain's jaw shut with an audible snap, his head slammed back by the force of the blow. He fell to the ground with all the grace of a sack of horse shit. Jack was turning away even before Kingsley's body had stopped moving. "Corporal Jones, make sure you drag this fool with us. Don't leave him behind, however tempted you may be." Jack nodded as the one corporal he could name doubled over and took a firm grip on Kingsley's collar. "Colour Sergeant Hughes." "Sir?" Hughes's reaction was instinctive. Jack might have been dressed as a common redcoat, but there was no doubting who was in command. "We will make a fighting retreat to the cantonment." "Sir." A flicker of concern appeared on the colour sergeant's weather-beaten face. It was a daunting order. The 24th would have to make its way over half a mile of open terrain whilst remaining in square. To accomplish it whilst being harassed by hundreds of horsemen was going to take a Herculean effort. "Have the NCOs watch the files at all times." Jack gave his orders calmly, despite the peril of the situation. "If we leave a gap, you can bet those bastards will be in here in a flash. If that happens, then we're all dead men." "Very good, sir." Hughes nodded his understanding. The 24th were about to attempt the near impossible. If they failed, they faced being butchered by the merciless horsemen who would soon swarm around them. Jack had saved them from the first dreadful moments of the enemy's charge. Now he had to bring them to safety. Chapter 36. The sepoys never stood a chance. Here and there a subadar managed to gather together enough men to force the Maharajah's irregular cavalry to veer away, but most of the native soldiers were simply cut down where they stood, butchered by the horsemen who rode them down with cruel precision. Some tried to run, throwing away their muskets as they made a desperate bid for safety, but there were simply too many horsemen for them to stand a chance. The sepoys were slaughtered, their heads and shoulders sliced open by the sharpened talwars. Dozens were killed in the first few minutes of the attack, flung to the ground to lie like discarded rag dolls, their precious lifeblood soaking into the parched soil beneath their ruined bodies. "Form on me!" Major Dutton screamed in desperation as he tried to rally the remains of the 3 shattered companies. "On me! On me!" A horseman rode close, his talwar aimed at Dutton's heart. Before he could get close, Dutton lifted his arm, aiming his revolver with bloodshot eyes. The bullet took the rider in the throat, snatching his body backwards, throwing him from the saddle. "On me! Spencer, here!" Dutton saw a hatless Lieutenant Spencer stagger from the melee. The tall officer looked up, and Dutton was given just enough time to see the look of anguish on his face. Before the young lieutenant was ridden down, a thick, pig-sticking spear punched through his stomach from behind. Dutton bellowed in rage. He emptied his revolver, killing another pair of fast-moving horsemen. He spied one of Gartry's subadars, holding a small group of sepoys together, and rode towards them, dodging around the wild hooves of a fallen horse that thrashed the ground in agony, a sepoy's bayonet driven full length into its chest. "Reload!" Dutton snapped the command as he forced his horse in among the sepoys. "Form 2 ranks. Front rank, kneel, and present bayonets." The orders came fast as he sought to bring order from the chaos. More men ran to join them, adding weight to the frail formation. Dozens more tried, but failed, the Maharajah's horsemen circling through the valley, cutting down the slowest, spilling still more blood on the arid soil. "Ready?" Dutton's hands worked furiously to reload the 5 chambers on his revolver. "Fire!" Fewer than a dozen muskets answered the order, a desultory volley that still managed to knock over a couple of the circling riders. Dutton glanced up quickly before returning his attention to his revolver. "Reload! Front rank! Prepare to receive cavalry!" He snapped his revolver shut and looked around, trying to begin to make sense of the disorder. He heard the ordered commands of a British officer, and through a gap in the cloud of powder smoke that billowed across the battlefield, he saw the 24th Square. The redcoats were firing when ready, a stream of musket fire rippling around the tight formation. Their steady fire was exacting a toll on the circling horsemen, who were already backing off, seeking easier targets amongst the scattered ranks of Dutton's own soldiers, the men he had failed, rather than face the disciplined bayonet walls of the 24th. Dutton sucked down his shame and his despair. The redcoats were still fighting. All was not lost. Jack stood in the centre of the square that inched slowly away from the carnage. Even with only 20 men on each face, it was an ungainly manoeuvre, many of the men forced to march either sideways or backwards as they tried to make progress towards the cantonment. The sergeants and corporals were screaming themselves hoarse as they constantly dressed the ranks to ensure they kept a wall of bayonets presented outwards. The redcoats were still firing on the enemy, but there were long gaps between shots, the sheer difficulty of reloading whilst constantly moving slowing their rate. Yet there were still enough muskets to fire on any rider who ventured close, and the irregular cavalry were becoming wary of the white-faced redcoats and their accuracy. Step by wary step, the 24th were dragging themselves clear. "Company! Company, halt!" Jack's voice cracked as he shouted the order, the foul-smelling powder smoke sucking every last drop of moisture from his parched mouth. He pushed himself into one of the flanks of the square so he could get a better view. The 24th had stopped barely 200 yards from where they had waited so patiently for the enemy to arrive. 200 yards that were now covered with the fallen bodies of the enemy cavalry, the company's passage marked in blood and spent cartridge wrappers. He took another faltering step away from the safety of the square, unable to fully comprehend what he was seeing. The enemy riders had gone. "They've gone to loot the cantonment." Captain Kingsley elbowed his way out of the square. "And you are going to hang." Jack was too tired to argue. "Form the men into column, Kingsley. Let's get them back whilst we can." He looked anxiously down the valley, expecting to see the rest of the Maharajah's force arrive at any moment. He offered a silent prayer of thanks to whichever god had been looking over the redcoats. If they had been facing the Maharajah's elite troops, then the battle would still be raging. Thankfully, the wild men from the hills were driven as much by the lust for plunder as they were by achieving the military aims of the Maharajah's lightning strike against Bundapur. They had fought hard, winning a fabulous victory by destroying the redcoats' frail line, but when faced with the choice of continuing the fight or being first into the cantonment, they had raked back their spurs and raced for the bungalows and barracks of the British camp, leaving their dead and dying comrades to bleed and suffer in the dust. "Damn you!" Kingsley spat the words into Jack's face. Jack was certain a raised fist would follow the oath, and he instinctively twisted on the spot, his arms raising to defend himself. Yet Kingsley was no fighter, and he took a step backwards, as if he too had expected to see a blow aimed squarely in his direction. "Corporal Jones, disarm this bastard and guard him. I want him in irons the moment we're back in the barracks." Kingsley snarled the order, hiding his fear under a thin veil of anger. Corporal Jones eased his way through the ranks of men who stood and stared at the captain. "Sir." Kingsley's anger flared. "Damn you, Corporal, arrest this man!" Corporal Jones stamped to attention. "Sir." Satisfied, Kingsley turned his back on Jack and stomped angrily into the safety of the square, bawling for Colour Sergeant Hughes to form a company column for the march back to the hastily erected fort that Dutton had insisted on building, and which now offered the redcoats their only hope of sanctuary. "Sorry, sir." Corporal Jones was apologetic as he reached for Jack's musket. Jack handed over the weapon. "Looks like you can drop the sir again, Corporal." Jones offered a thin-lipped smile. "The man's a cock." "He's an officer." Jack returned the grin. "What else do you expect?" "Captain Kingsley, well done. Well done indeed." Major Proudfoot stood just outside the temporary wall that had been built from mealie bags and storage crates. He had begun to clap as the weary company from the 24th trudged back, and now he shouted his approval to welcome their return. Kingsley strode forward, his chin lifting as he accepted the applause. He shook Proudfoot's hand before turning back to face his command. If either officer saw the scathing look on the grimy faces of the redcoats, then neither made any remark of it. The two officers stood back and watched as the exhausted soldiers clambered over the 3-foot-high defensive wall. "I had to have that bounder Lark arrested. He tried to run." Kingsley's smug expression betrayed his satisfaction at delivering the accusation, as Corporal Jones reluctantly brought Jack to stand in front of the two officers. "That's a bare-faced lie." Jack delivered his reply calmly. "I saved the fool's company, although I had to knock him down so I could do it without his damn interference. But his men fought well. They are good soldiers." He raised his voice so that the tired redcoats could hear his praise. Proudfoot turned to face Captain Kingsley as if Jack had never spoken. "Well done, Kingsley. You have delivered your men safely. That is highly commendable under the circumstances, highly commendable indeed." Corporal Jones cleared his throat noisily. "Corporal, you wish to speak?" Major Proudfoot lifted an eyebrow as the corporal dared to interrupt. Jones' face glowed as scarlet as his jacket. It was likely the first time he'd ever spoken to anyone as senior as a major. "Yes, sir. If you please, sir." "Well, out with it." Proudfoot was all warmth. He glanced over his shoulder and saw dozens of the 24th watching him, the whites of their eyes bright against the thick caking of dust and sweat that smothered their young faces. "Do not be afraid to speak." "Mr. Lark didn't run, sir." "Shut your mouth, Corporal," Kingsley interrupted. He stepped forward so that he stood chest to chest with Jones. "This is not the time for your damn lies." "Captain Kingsley, let the man speak." Proudfoot's voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the authority in his tone. Kingsley opened his mouth to argue further. "I shall not stand here and—" "Let him speak!" Proudfoot screamed the words. The sudden rage was astonishing, and Kingsley quailed. "Please, carry on, Corporal." Proudfoot was all polite reason again, the sudden flash of bright anger hidden once more. "Sir." Corporal Jones stood to attention, seeking some familiar security as he dared to speak out. "Mr. Lark saved us, sir, not Captain Kingsley. Without Mr. Lark, I reckon we would all be dead uns." "Thank you, Corporal." Proudfoot turned and smiled warmly at the watching redcoats. "I'm glad you felt you could speak out. I thank you for your words." Jack was close enough to see that none of the warmth reached Proudfoot's eyes. He met the Major's stare, sensing the anger that simmered just below the surface. "Corporal, please carry on." Proudfoot gave the order, and a relieved Jones stamped his foot once before scurrying away. "Captain Kingsley, Mr. Lark, please come with me. We have much to do." Proudfoot turned on his heel and walked away. Behind them, the remnants of Dutton's command were limping towards the temporary fortress. Less than half of his men were still standing, and the watching redcoats of the 24th saw the horror in the native soldiers' eyes as they staggered towards the barracks. Dutton rode in alone. None of his 3 lieutenants had survived the massacre, and so he returned at the head of his battered command as the sole surviving white officer. Not one of the watching redcoats could meet his eye as he clambered wearily from the saddle, the bitterness of defeat hanging around him like a cloud. Chapter 37. "He's gone." Jack was astonished. "Fenris left an hour ago with the last of Proudfoot's cavalry. Gone to summon assistance." Dutton sounded bone-weary as he replied. Jack looked hard at the British major. For a reason he could not fully fathom, Proudfoot had let him go free, despite Kingsley's loud protest for him to be locked away. With no other responsibilities to tend to, he had sought the major out, bringing with him a bottle of Proudfoot's brandy to loosen Dutton's tongue and allow him some solace. Jack had seen the man's shame. He himself could well remember the heavy burden of having failed when faced with the enemy for the first time. They sat on the defensive wall barricading the small area where the tired sepoys and redcoats huddled together, sharing the harsh spirit and watching in silence as the cantonment burned. The sounds of the looters were loud in the darkness, the wild, cackling laughter and shrieks of delight reaching the ears of the exhausted redcoats who had been dispersed around the short perimeter. Occasional gunshots rang out, but whether they were fired in anger or in celebration, Jack could not tell. Dutton's fortress had good fields of fire on 3 sides, the wide sweep of the parade ground wrapping around the 24th's barracks, which formed the eastern wall of the defensive line. On the far side of the barracks, a series of administrative buildings lined a neat pathway that had been edged with whitewashed rocks. It was the one weak spot in the fortress, and all the men knew it. The 24th had spent the last hours making their barracks as impregnable as possible, gouging dozens of loopholes in the side facing the east, and barricading the wide windows that had once been so coveted, but which were now the building's biggest weakness. There was nothing else they could do. They all knew the barracks would be the scene of the heaviest fighting when the Maharajah's army arrived to attack the survivors of Proudfoot's forces. "Wanted to keep his special chumps safe, I expect." Dutton's voice was slurred, and he took another large mouthful of the brandy. "Good riddance, if you ask me." Jack reached out for the bottle, wiping the neck on the sleeve of his red coat before taking a more circumspect sip. He was surprised at Proudfoot's decision to send Fenris away. Where will he go? "Fort St. John. There's a column based there. Mainly cavalry, too." Dutton looked longingly at the brandy as Jack drained a fair quantity of the precious liquid. "Because of me, we need help." His head hung in shame as he admitted his error. "You wanted to fight. That's what it's like." Dutton looked up at Jack's harsh words, pain etched into the lines on his face. "I was a fool. I wish I had died with my men." Jack scowled. "Then you truly are a fool. You're alive. Be thankful for that." Jack snatched the brandy back, lifting the bottle to his lips, but keeping his eyes on Jack as he drank, careless of the fiery liquid that spilled from his mouth to run into his beard. When he finally lowered the bottle, he turned to stare outwards again, the light of the burning cantonment reflecting in his moist eyes. "I killed them, Jack. I killed my own men." "No, those bastard horsemen killed them." Dutton shook his head slowly. "I fired too late. If I'd given the order earlier, we would have stopped them, as you did." "You did your best." "And I failed." Dutton's head hung so that his chin rested on his chest, as if his neck was no longer capable of supporting its weight. "I know." Jack waited for Dutton to look at him. It took a while, but eventually the Major raised his head. "It was your first battle." Jack spoke softly. "It's not some bloody parade. It's vicious and it's violent." He held Dutton's stare as he spoke, delivering his biting judgment with bitter honesty. "Either you live or you die, and there's bugger all you can do about which of those it is. You and your men fought hard, and you brought as many of them here as you could. That's all that matters." Dutton looked at Jack for some time, as if trying to come to terms with what the younger man had said. Eventually his face softened, whether from finding some peace of mind or simply from the large amount of brandy he had consumed, Jack could not tell. "So, what happens tomorrow?" Dutton asked, his voice calm once again. "They attack. Those horsemen today were just his irregular cavalry. The main body of his army has only just arrived. I expect we'll have to face his infantry first, and believe me, there are a lot of those bastards. They'll hit us on all sides, and if we break, he'll send in his bloody lancers." He turned as he heard the soft tread of footsteps behind them, wary of anyone coming in to interrupt their conversation. "Good evening, General." "Isabel." Jack could not hide the pleasure in his voice. "Does your father know you're here?" He smiled as he helped her onto the fire step behind the barricade, offering her his hand so that she could sit beside him. "Father is drunk." The corners of Isabel's mouth twitched in disapproval. "Sensible fellow." Dutton took another slug of brandy, already too drunk himself to be concerned about his behaviour in front of a lady. "Perhaps. May I?" Isabel held out her hand questioningly towards the brandy, which Dutton passed over, as if sharing hard spirits with young women was an everyday occurrence. She took a demure sip, grimacing at the harsh taste. "Your wife is asking after you, Major Dutton. She seems most concerned." Dutton shook his head ruefully. "Poor Hilary. She's not cut out for any of this." Jack felt Isabel's body pressing against his side as she sat beside him. She smelt wonderful, the delicate fragrance of her fresh perfume a balm to his soul, its subtle aroma driving away the smell of burning and of death. "She is made of sterner stuff than you give her credit for," she replied evenly, brushing at her dress. "She is with the wounded, doing what she can to help." "She's a fine woman. She deserves better." "None of us chooses our fate." Isabel looked at Jack as she offered her advice to Dutton. "It chooses us. All we decide is how we face it." The three sat in silence as they contemplated Isabel's words. The cantonment was well ablaze, the heat of the flames warm on their faces as the chill of the night set in. Shadowy figures flitted into view amidst the burning buildings, but none ventured close to the temporary refuge the British had erected. It seemed the survivors were to be left in peace for the night. Isabel slipped her hand forward so that it rested on Jack's thigh. "Perhaps we didn't do the right thing after all." She broke the silence with a whisper, her mouth close enough to Jack's ear that he could feel the warmth of her breath on the side of his face. Her fingers were like red-hot coals on his leg, and he wished they were alone. "And miss all this? How can you even think that?" Isabel rapped his leg. "So, what happens now?" "We fight." An unexpected voice answered her question. None of the three had heard the footsteps of Major Proudfoot as he approached. "We hold here until the flying column from Fort St. John arrives. Isn't that right, Lark?" Proudfoot bounded onto the firestep, the jet-black cloak draped over his shoulders billowing around him as he leapt athletically over the wall of mealie bags, landing on the balls of his feet before turning to face his meagre audience. Jack looked at the odd creature that had capered across the wall like a demented goat. "I reckon that's right." His voice was guarded. "Major Dutton." Proudfoot lifted a quizzical eyebrow in his subordinate's direction. "Can we hold?" "Maybe. Maybe not." Proudfoot nodded his head as if Dutton had offered wise advice rather than such a bitter statement. He spun on his heel and studied the burning cantonment for some time. "Do you think we can hold?" Isabel asked the question to the back of Proudfoot's head when she could stand the silence no longer. "Of course," the Major answered without turning round. "But perhaps you should ask the commander of the 24th. "He's not here." Jack answered the odd question. "Kingsley appears to have disappeared." "Captain Kingsley is indisposed." Proudfoot steadfastly refused to turn around and remained facing the fires. "He's with the sick. He will stay there until after the battle. He took a nasty blow to the head, and it has quite addled his wits." "Then ask your lapdog when he gets back." Jack's opinion of the lieutenant was clear in his derisory tone. Proudfoot wheeled round suddenly, and Jack felt Isabel start at the dramatic posturing. "Fenris does not command the 24th. "Then who will?" Jack's tone was belligerent. He'd endured enough of the Major's games. "You. You will command them." "Me?" Jack was genuinely astonished. "As of this moment, I am promoting you. You are to be Captain Lark. The 24th are yours." Jack blinked hard. "I thought I was to hang." Proudfoot smiled. For the first time, Jack saw some warmth make its way into the Major's eyes. "That was before. This is now. I want you to command the 24th. You are the best man for the job. You proved that today." Jack laughed. He threw back his head and guffawed, careless of the men who turned to stare at the madman hooting so loudly. "Do you accept?" Proudfoot chuckled, joining in Jack's mirth. "Oh, yes, I accept." Jack slipped from the wall and walked to stand in front of the Major. "Then you will be wanting this." Proudfoot pulled open his cloak. For the first time, Jack saw that he was wearing a sword. His sword. He watched, his heart hammering in his mouth, as Proudfoot undid the buckles that held the scabbard around his waist. It was only when the Major handed him the fabulous weapon that he realized how much he had missed it since it had been taken from him when he had first been arrested. He had never owned anything of such extraordinary value, yet it was not the wealth it gave him that he had missed. He had been awarded the sword for his bravery. He had not bought it, he had not taken it, he had earned it. Jack took a step backwards and carefully, reverentially, buckled the slings of the scabbard to the belt around his waist. He was a captain. This time he hadn't stolen the rank, it had been granted freely. He was an officer. It might only be temporary and out of convenience, but it did not matter. He had been a Maharajah's general, then a British redcoat. Now, for the first time, he was Captain Jack Lark. Perhaps it would only be for a matter of hours, but Jack did not care. He would lead the 24th into battle, and he vowed he would not let them down. Chapter 38. The noise started just before dawn. The impenetrable blackness of the night still wrapped its heavy arms around the tired redcoats in Dutton's temporary fortress, when the wild blare of trumpets split the quietness asunder. The sounds rose in a crescendo, the chaotic medley denying the defenders the sanctuary of sleep. Underscoring the frenzied orchestra was the deep, visceral chanting of hundreds of voices, which came and went in waves of sound, throbbing and pulsating with a nerve-jangling tremor. The violence in the air was palpable, and every redcoat shivered as they listened to the mob that had arrived and was now preparing for the battle to come. The defenders greeted the dreadful cacophony in silence. Each man was left alone with his fears, forced to endure the last of the night wrestling with his demons unaided. It was the time for silent prayer and superstitious ritual, for each redcoat to find a way to face the peril they knew would come with the dawn. "Stand to!" The two surviving buglers sounded the rising notes as the first enemy troops were sighted. The defenders took their places in the bayonet-tipped perimeter, which would have to stand firm if they were to survive the day. Dutton's sepoys manned the outer wall. Just under 150 men had answered the roll call in the cold air before sunrise, less than half of the 3 companies left after the previous day's massacre. Their ranks had been swelled by a number of servants who had stayed loyal to their masters and who had been given hasty lessons in how to reload a musket. The extra bodies and the shortness of the perimeter allowed Dutton to keep back 50 men, whom he organised into a flying column, ready to pounce on any part of the wall that started to give way. The 24th were left to defend their barracks and the storerooms that formed the easternmost wall. The long, airy barrack block had been transformed into a stronghold, allowing the redcoats to bring as many guns as possible to bear on the narrow pathway that made straight for the pair of wide double doors facing the east. Any attack on this side of the fortress could be made under cover, the attackers only having to break into the open when they were no more than 15 to 20 yards away. The 24th would have to fight the Maharajah's men in bloody hand-to-hand combat, the power of their muskets diminished by the lack of an open field of fire. The rest of the cantonment's population was crammed into the largest room in the 24th's barracks that did not have a wall or window facing to the east. There the wives, children and clerks would have to endure the battle, sweltering in the heat as they willed the defenders to hold out. It was a time for prayers, for the faithful to beseech their God with pleas for deliverance. It was a time for hopes to dwindle, and for men to place their faith in 17 inches of cold steel. Jack peered out of the window. The fresh breeze was cool against his skin, the layer of grime and sweat congealing to leave his face feeling as stiff as dried parchment. The bugles were calling for the defenders to be ready, the first sighting of the enemy stirring Dutton's men into action. The proud notes sounded defiant, the clear rising call a challenge to the bewildering hubbub that summoned the Maharajah's men to readiness. "Hold your fire!" Jack pulled back from the window and walked down the centre of the barracks. He had over half his men at the eastern wall, their bayonet-tipped muskets pointing out of the windows or loopholes, ready to fire as soon as the first enemy soldier dared to show his face. He had stationed another 15 on the roof to act as sharp shooters under the command of Colour Sergeant Hughes. He hoped they would be able to fire down onto the heads of any enemy troops milling around outside the barracks. The final dozen waited as a reserve, ready to plug the inevitable gaps, Jack's final throw of the dice should the Maharajah's men force a breach in his defences. "Shoot the bastards in the guts." Jack stalked behind the men pressed to the wall. "Make them bleed." He offered his advice in the even tones of an instructor on the firing range, as if they faced stuffed woolen dummies rather than men bent on their destruction. "The more you kill, the fewer you'll have to fight." He caught the eye of Corporal Jones. The Welshman stood at the head of Jack's flying squad, looking as composed as if the 24th faced nothing more than a routine drill. "Be ready for my signal, Corporal." "We'll be ready, sir." Jones risked a smile. "Feels right to call you sir again, sir." Jack paused in his pacing. "Thank you, Corporal. I'll do my best not to be a cock." Corporal Jones coloured as the other redcoats smiled at Jack's choice of language. Jack looked into the eyes of the men now under his command. He saw their fear, the waiting pulling at their courage, but he recognised their determination to get the job done. His hand fell to the talwar at his hip. He ran his fingers over the coarse sharkskin grip, the knowledge that he would soon draw the blade in anger for the first time adding to his own anxiety. On his other hip he could feel the reassuring weight of his revolver. He had borrowed the gun from Major Dutton, unwilling to fight without one. He was still dressed in the red coat of a private soldier, but now he at least carried the weapons of an officer. Like his men, he was ready to fight. "Sir, here they come." Jack whirled on the spot. "Company, ready!" He shouted the needless order, his men already bracing themselves for the attack. Those stationed at the windows and loopholes pulled their muskets into their shoulders, aiming the weapons outside. The men in the flying squad hefted their muskets or reached for their bayonets, reassuring themselves that the 17 inches of steel was attached securely. The tramp of footsteps rolled down the pathway that led away from the barracks. It was the rhythmic thump of men marching in formation, the regular tempo of disciplined troops manoeuvring into position. "Prepare to fire!" Jack peered anxiously into the bright sunlight. The path was empty, but he knew the enemy was close. He let his hand fall to his hip, undoing the flap of his holster so he could withdraw the heavy revolver. The solid lump of metal was cold to his touch, but it felt good to have the weapon in his hand. The pounding stopped. The ears of every man stationed in the barracks strained to hear the sound of the attack beginning. The red-coated soldiers waited anxiously, their nerves screwed to fever pitch as they endured the last moments of peace. Loud voices echoed around the remains of the cantonment, the last shouted orders as the defenders prepared for the assault. Yet not one enemy soldier was in sight. Jack could barely breathe as he stared out of the barracks window. He could sense the enemy soldiers were close by, but they remained stubbornly out of view. "Come on now. This ain't bleeding fair." The redcoat to Jack's right muttered the words under his breath as he continued to peer down the barrel of his musket. "They're coming." Jack reached out and patted the redcoat on the shoulder. He pulled back and quickly moved to a window near the centre of the barracks, seeing if the new viewpoint would reveal the enemy. Nothing. And then they appeared. They came in a rush. One moment the pathway was empty. A heartbeat later, the enemy infantry rushed forward, erupting around the corner in a wild mob. "Company!" Jack's voice was steady despite his heart hammering in his chest. He had a moment to realise that the men swarming towards the 24th's barracks were dressed in the splendid red and blue uniform of the Maharajah's guards, the familiar sight sending a tremor of guilt through his soul. "Fire!" The muskets fired in unison. The enemy were close enough for Jack to hear the grotesque sound of the bulls slapping into living flesh, followed by the screams of those struck down. There was no time for the men to reload before the enemy reached the walls, and for a dreadful second there was a silence as the appalled redcoats witnessed the destructive power of their volley at such close range. The musket balls had cut a bloody swathe through the leading ranks. Many guardsmen had been struck by more than one bullet, their bodies shredded by the disciplined fire. Dozens of the enemy had been cut down, the storm of musket fire gutting the attack. Jack nearly choked on the foul-smelling powder smoke that filled the room, his eyes watering as the rotten egg stench filled his mouth and nose. "Kill them!" He screamed the order, breaking the spell that the sudden lull had cast over the redcoats. Through the smoke, he could see the enemy charging at the walls, the Maharajah's best soldiers clambering over the dead and the dying, callous in their desire to reach the hated redcoats. The men Jack had stationed on the roof opened fire as the enemy stormed forwards. He could hear Hughes marking the targets for his sharpshooters. Half a dozen of the blue-coated guardsmen fell to the well-directed fire, their bodies tumbling to the ground, trampled underneath the boots of their fellows. The first enemy soldier reached the wall. His tulwar keened as it sliced through the air, the man behind the blade screaming like a fiend as he tried to strike at the redcoats who waited behind the window. The killing began. More and more of the enemy pressed up to the windows. Blade after blade was thrust forward, reaching for the flesh of the defiant redcoats. A dozen or more guardsmen packed against each of the opening. Each rammed his weapon forward, striving to be the first to break into the heart of the foreigner's stronghold. The redcoats held their ground. Time and time again they punched their bayonets forward, using the point of the vicious 17-inch blade just as they had been taught on the drill square. They plied their trade with dreadful effect, taking advantage of the height of their position to hack down at the faces of the enemy horde. The men at the loopholes loaded as quickly as they could before thrusting their weapons out once more, the cough of the muskets cracking out every few moments. "Hold them! Hold them!" Jack screamed his encouragement, his voice straining with the effort. More of the enemy were falling to the shots coming from the roof. Hughes was controlling his sharpshooters well, directing an effective fire that was striking man after man from the Maharajah's ranks. Still, they pressed forward, ignoring the dead and the dying underneath their boots, the ruined bodies trodden thoughtlessly into the dust as the guardsmen strove to batter their way into the barracks. The redcoats were fighting hard, but the enemy were relentless. Each redcoat faced a dozen blades. As quickly as they struck one man down, another two took his place. Sharp tulwars were thrust forward from every direction, and the redcoats were reduced to a desperate defence as they were forced to block again and again, the enemy blades reaching for them with dreadful persistence. "Hold them!" Jack threw himself forward as the first redcoat fell to the ground, his hands clutched to the ruin of his throat, ripped open by a fast-moving sword edge. He snapped his left hand forward, thrusting the barrel of his revolver into the thickly bearded face of the first enemy soldier to reach up and try to scramble through the window. "Fuck off!" he screamed as he pulled the trigger. The man's face disappeared as the heavy bullet punched through skin and bone, a nauseating explosion of blood and offal splattering both Jack and the two redcoats who were still desperately defending the window. Jack pushed into the gap the fallen redcoat had left. The blue-coated infantry were pressed tight against the window, and now they were reaching up to haul themselves into the opening. Jack got a blurred impression of the hatred in the bright eyes of the dark, bearded faces as he raised his revolver once more and fired into the pulsating mass that screamed its horrifying war cry in the faces of the defenders. The 4 bullets left in the revolver punched into the closest bodies. Jack steadied his aim after each shot, making sure each one counted. The dreadful salvo cleared a space, each bullet striking a man to the floor, easing the pressure on the route into the barracks. Jack saw the opening and reacted without thought. The madness was irresistible. As soon as he had pulled the trigger for the first time, it had overwhelmed him. Nothing mattered save the dreadful urge to fight, to hack at the enemy. He put one arm on the ledge and leapt through the window. Chapter 39. He landed on the balls of his feet, the small drop down from the window barely registering in his mind. His beautiful sword whispered from the scabbard, the bright gems encrusted on the hilt flashing in the bright sunlight. The wild call of battle surged through him, the same soul-searing madness that had driven him into the Russian ranks at the Alma coursing through his veins. He flailed the sword forward, sweeping its sharpened edge in an upward arc, slashing it into the astonished face of the closest enemy soldier. The talwar scoured through the man's heavy beard, gashing a wide channel that immediately filled with blood before the man fell to the floor, his hand clasped to the dreadful wound. Jack recovered the blade, punching the hilt forward, driving the heavy guard into his next target. He screamed as he fought, a terrible snarl of animal anger. He moved fast, and the blade sang as he threw himself at the enemy. He thrust the point hard into a man's guts before recovering the blow and flashing the blade away, using the sharpened rear blade to slash the throat of another blue-coated soldier who took the first pace towards his left side. "Come on!" He challenged the enemy to attack him. He twisted on the spot, sliding his hips to one side to let an enemy talwar whistle past his body before countering with his own blade, skewering the man who had tried to kill him with a single thrust to the heart. He stamped forward, moving away from the window and into the space he had cleared. He did not feel the bodies under his boots, the flesh that slipped and pulsed under his callous tread. He felt nothing save the urge to fight. "Forward the 24th!" The loud cry barely registered in Jack's mind. He saw the eyes of the men to his front widen as more redcoats threw themselves from the window, Corporal Jones leading his flying squad in a wild charge after their captain. The dozen redcoats drove into the packed ranks of blue-coated soldiers, firing the shots saved for this moment. The close-range volley butchered the nearest enemy soldiers, knocking them over like skittles at the fair. The redcoats did not hesitate. They stormed forward, thrusting their bayonets at any stunned guardsman left standing. They forced their way through the men who milled around the window in an onslaught of bloody violence that had the enemy soldiers backing away in horror. In the face of the counterattack, the enemy ranks broke. The press of bodies eased as the Maharajah's men turned and ran, pushing and pulling at each other in their eagerness to get away from the red-coated devils who had charged with such madness. The men from the 24th that Jack had stationed on the roof kept up their fire as the enemy fled, picking at the retreating mob, adding impetus to the rout. Jack's lungs heaved as he tried to suck in mouthfuls of the scorching air. He sank to his haunches, suddenly exhausted, his battle rage vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Sir?" Corporal Jones appeared at his side, his gory, blood-spattered bayonet held inches from Jack's nose. "Time to get back inside." Jack wiped his face with the dark green facing of his jacket. "Thank you for coming after me, Corporal." "My pleasure, Buck. We couldn't lose our only officer now, could we? Right careless that would be." Jack nodded his thanks. A sea of blood surrounded him, the twisted and torn bodies of the men the redcoats had struck down littering the ground. Some still moved, living on despite the dreadful wounds they had taken, their pitiful groans and whimpers loud in the sudden lull. A fresh round of musket fire broke out. Jack sheathed his sword, ignoring the blood that was smeared on the beautifully decorated steel. The 24th had driven off the Maharajah's first assault, but the rest of the tiny fortress was still under attack. "Corporal Jones, leave half the men here. Give me the rest. We'd better see if we're needed outside." Jack snapped off the order within moments of climbing back into the smoke-filled barracks. There was no time to take stock or to rest on their laurels. Dutton and his sepoys were still heavily engaged, and Jack would not let them fight on alone. "Very good, sir." And, "Well done." Jack raised his voice so that the watching redcoats could hear his words. 3 of their number lay stretched out on the ground, whilst many others nursed cuts and wounds caused by the sharp sabres that had tried so hard to strike them down. They had been lucky. "Sergeant," Jack called to one of the company sergeants, whose name he did not know, "stay here. Make sure the men are loaded, and that they all have a full pouch of caps and cartridges." "Sir." Jack turned to the hastily formed platoon that Corporal Jones had put together. "Stay with me. Let's go." They set off at a fast trot. The sounds of muskets firing had ceased, but they could all hear the clash of blade on blade. The perimeter was hard-pressed on all sides. Dutton had already been forced to commit his own flying squad to reinforce the north wall, where the Maharajah's men had nearly broken through. Everywhere the sepoys were fighting hard, Dutton's command fully engaged as the swarm of men pressed along the length of the makeshift barricade. Jack flinched as a volley of musket fire cracked out from overhead. The resourceful Colour Sergeant Hughes had turned his men around, bringing the muskets under his command to bear on the closest enemy troopers attacking the rest of the perimeter, and Jack made a mental note to thank him later. He turned to his men. "Follow me. Whatever happens, stay together." He scanned the grimy faces, which looked back at him with intensity. He could see the determination in their eyes. His new command would not let him down. They went off at double time, their equipment clattering as it bounced off their bodies. Jack led them fast across the parade ground and towards the western wall, where he saw at least a dozen sepoys on the ground. "Forward the 24th!" His sword rasped as he pulled it from the scabbard. The dusty ground passed quickly under their fast-moving boots, the last yards rushing by. Jack saw a tall, blue-coated guardsman pull himself onto the barricade. The huge man kicked out, smashing his foot into the face of a sepoy who had been raising his bayonet to cut him down. The attacker threw his head back, screaming his challenge to the gods before he leapt down onto the sepoy's side of the barricade. Men poured over the makeshift wall behind him, a dozen of the Maharajah's best troops finally forcing their way into Dutton's fortress. "At them!" Jack screamed the command to his company. The giant guardsman saw him coming and took a double-handed grip on his huge tulwar. Jack recognized him instantly. Subadar Khan was serving his master well by leading his men from the front. "He's mine!" Jack roared the challenge, rushing towards the man he had come to know during his time in the Maharajah's palace. He could not let any of his men face the huge man in combat. That responsibility was his, and his alone. He slashed his own sword forward as he skidded to a halt, flashing the blade at Khan's body. He sensed his men pushing past, wielding their own weapons as they fought to drive the enemy back over the barricade, leaving him to fight alone. "Come on then, laddie! Let's fucking dance!" Khan parried the first attack, swatting Jack's fast-moving blade aside with ease. His counterstroke lashed out, but Jack had been ready for it, and he ducked low, letting the tulwar swipe through the air over his head. He recovered his balance and attacked again, battering his sword at the target in front of him. Khan snarled in anger as the speed of Jack's blows forced him to give ground before he scythed his own tulwar back, the growl turning to a roar of frustration as Jack parried the attack. Jack was astonished by the calmness running through him. There was none of the battle madness that had taken charge when he flung himself through the barrack room window. Instead he fought with icy detachment, his fear banished and replaced by composed confidence. He thrust his tulwar forward, aiming it directly at Khan's heart, picking the spot with ruthless precision. He felt nothing as the Subadar parried the blow, driving his blade wide. He waited for the inevitable counterattack, snapping his neck backward so that Khan's wild slash whispered past his face. "Damn you, laddie!" Khan roared before he attacked again, flailing his sword at Jack's body, his words drowned out as the two swords clashed together. Jack stayed silent, his emotions banished. He felt no remorse. He stamped his foot forward, attacking with a series of blows that used all of his speed. Again and again Khan parried the flashing tulwar, each time only just catching Jack's blade an instant before it ripped into his flesh. Around him the 24th drove the enemy soldiers backwards, forcing the Maharajah's men back over the wall. They were not having it all their own way. 2 redcoats were down, their bodies torn open by the sabres of the blue-coated soldiers, who fought on even as they were driven backwards, refusing to give up the hard-won foothold on the redcoat side of the barricade. Khan came at Jack, releasing a blow driven by a wild fury. Jack stepped backwards quickly, letting the tulwar pass in front of his body. As the blade went wide, he saw his opportunity. He snapped his wrist forward, ramming the point of his sword into the giant man's chest, the force of the blow driving it deep into the man's body. Khan grunted as the blade pierced his flesh. Yet still he fought on, slashing his tulwar at Jack in a final gesture of defiance. Jack twisted as he suddenly saw the fast-moving blade in the corner of his vision. He flung his arm up into the sword's path, the reaction uncontrolled and instinctive. The sharpened blade sliced into his left forearm. He felt the edge bounce off the bone before the burning agony seared into his skull. Then Khan fell. Jack's talwar was ripped from his grip, the beautiful blade trapped, buried nearly to the hilt in his adversary's body. Jack clasped his right hand over the deep gouge that was already slick with blood. He barely heard the cheer as the last of the blue-coated infantry were forced back over the wall, his exhausted redcoats driving off the enemy soldiers who had come so close to breaking their dogged resistance. He stared down into the face of Subadar Khan, who lay in the dust no more than a foot from his boot. The Maharajah's officer was dead, his eyes glazed, his life torn away. Jack gripped his arm, feeling the blood pulse over his fingers as it pumped out with every beat of his racing heart. He forced the coldness into his soul, denying the emotion that was trying to take control. The shouts of victory sounded distant as he nursed his wound, the defenders roaring in triumph as the Maharajah's finest troops pulled back, beaten by the resolute defiance of the redcoats. The defenders of Bundapur had survived the first attack. Chapter 40. Hold still. It bloody hurts. Don't be such a baby. Isabel stuck the tip of her tongue out as she concentrated on tying off the bandage she had used to cover Jack's wound. Sweet Jesus! Jack hissed the oath as the tight binding sent a spasm of pain running up his arm. Listen to you. Isabel shook her head in resignation, busying herself gathering up the cloths she had used to clean the wound. I've never heard such a fuss. My apologies, Ma'am. Jack opened and closed his hand, testing its mobility. The pain was like a red-hot poker buried deep in his flesh, but his arm was usable. He had been lucky. Khan's strength had been failing when the blow landed. Had it been driven with full force, Jack knew he could have lost the arm. You should take better care of yourself. Isabel tried to sound light-hearted, but Jack could hear the strain in her voice. A smear of blood had dried on her cheek, the grotesque rouge dark against her pale skin. For the first time, Jack understood her father's longing for her to live a normal life. She did not deserve to be surrounded by death. A girl her age should be worrying about what dress to wear to the ball, which gentleman would receive the honour of being the first name on her dance card. She should not be forced to wallow in blood, bearing witness to the basest emotions of man. You should go home, Izzy. He spoke softly. Isabel bit her lip. He saw the pain in the green eyes that had so captivated him from the first moment he had seen her at Proudfoot's gathering the night he had arrived in Bundapur. She didn't speak, but Jack caught the slightest nod of her head as she acknowledged his words. He reached across with his good arm, entwining his fingers around hers. You deserve so much more than this. Isabel shook her head, forcing down the shudder that ran through her body. There, that's your arm done. Her voice was cool. She slid her hand from his, gathering up the remnants of bandage before wiping clean the blood-stained scissors that she then slipped back into the front pocket of her smock. How does it feel? Jack lifted his arm, flexing the fingers to demonstrate the successful dressing of his wound. It hurts, but it's fine. It won't stop you fighting. Jack looked up sharply as he heard the ice in her voice. No, it won't stop me. It can't. So you can do your duty. You can go on killing. Jack closed his eyes. Her bitterness hurt. When he opened them once more, she was staring at him. Yes, He acknowledged her condemning words. "I'll fight." "You frighten me, Jack." Isabel's voice cracked. "And I'm so tired of being scared." The words were like barbs. She sniffed once more before rising to her feet, brushing away the dirt that had stuck to her simple dress. The heavy tread of army boots prevented Jack from saying anything further, and he too eased himself upright, cradling his arm gingerly as he moved. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Major Proudfoot would like you both to join him." Colour Sergeant Hughes stood ramrod straight in the doorway, his eyes elevated as if embarrassed at spoiling the moment. Jack smiled at the sergeant's sensibilities. He couldn't help thinking how he could have used a man like Hughes in the Crimea. "Thank you, Colour Sergeant." "How's the arm, sir?" "Bearable. It could have been worse." "Indeed, sir. I was watching you." The Colour Sergeant spoke plainly. "You fought like the very devil." "Mr. Lark is a fool, Colour Sergeant," Isabel interrupted. "He throws himself around like a schoolboy, thinking he cannot come to harm." "He's an officer, ma'am. It's what they do." Hughes offered the explanation as if it was all the answer that was needed. "The best of them, anyhow." Yet Jack heard the censure in Isabel's words. The enemy were at the walls, and he would have to fight again if he was to do his duty. But he knew he was losing the girl who had saved him. Doing his duty came with a price. Jack helped Isabel across the barricade, cherishing the thin smile she gave him in thanks. They had been ordered by Major Proudfoot to join the deputation that would answer the enemy's summons to a parley. A party of exhausted sepoys were checking the enemy bodies that littered the ground outside the barricade, doing their best to separate the living from the dead. There was no time for anything more. The dead would simply have to be left where they lay. They had at least cleared a path, so that Isabel and the cantonment's officers would not have to walk on a carpet of bodies, although the ground under their feet was still soaked in blood, the pale, dusty soil stained dark mulberry. Proudfoot was dressed in uniform, the first time Jack had seen him in the scarlet coat of a British officer. Ever the dandy, he had eschewed the regulation shako, preferring to wear in its place an old-fashioned bicorn topped with an enormous ostrich feather. "I hope the bastards are asking for permission to bugger off," Dutton growled as he walked at Jack's side. "I beg your pardon, of course, Miss Young Summers." Isabel looked across Jack and smiled sweetly. "I have spent too long with Jack to be shocked or offended by such words, Major Dutton. Have no fear for my sensibilities." Major Proudfoot heard the words and laughed aloud. "You have a great deal to answer for, Jack." There was no trace of nervousness on his face. Clearly being summoned to a flag of truce on a blood-stained battlefield did not daunt the British political officer. "As do you." Jack's arm was hurting like the very devil, and his reply was belligerent. Proudfoot simply shrugged the barbed comment away. "I am glad the Maharajah demanded that you and Miss Young Summers join our jolly gathering. It would have been so dull with just Dutton for company." They picked their way over the blood-stained ground beyond the north wall in silence. Jack wondered at the Maharajah's summons. He felt the twist of nerves deep in his gut as he walked towards the man he had abandoned. Isabel's presence only added to his disquiet, and he wondered what strange design the quixotic ruler of Sawad was trying to conjure. As the two parties came together just 50 yards away from the defenders' perimeter, Jack studied the three men who had called for the truce. He was not surprised to see the Maharajah. He could not imagine the ruler of Sawad leaving the negotiations to anyone else. He was flanked by his son and by the grey-haired general Jack had met for the first time at the Conference of War, shortly before he and Isabel had fled. "Sire," Proudfoot opened the conversation, "I truly regret it has come to this." The Maharajah's face creased as he tried to contain his temper. "No, I don't think you do. I think this suits you very well." Proudfoot looked suitably shocked at the accusation. "I cannot fathom why you would say that, sire. No man can wish for war." The Maharaja snorted before focusing on Jack. "So, my general now fights against me." Jack had forgotten the force of the Maharaja's personality. It was only as the man's hard brown eyes fixed his own that he felt the first stirring of remorse. Until then he had simply been carrying out his duty, doing what he knew best. Coming face to face with the Maharaja once again made him doubt the wisdom of his choice. "I had no option, sir." To his surprise, the Maharaja smiled. "I would not have expected anything else from you, Jack. You would have disappointed me had you betrayed the country of your birth. As much as I might wish you had chosen differently, I want you to know that I forgive you. I bear you no ill will." Jack found it hard to swallow, and remained silent as the Maharaja turned to Isabel. "You should not be on the field of battle, Miss Young Summers." "Where else would I be, Your Highness?" Isabel lifted her chin as she answered the Maharaja. "I would wish you were somewhere safe. I would ask you to consider coming back with me. I will personally vouch for your safety." Jack saw the look of longing in Prince Abhishek's eyes. Clearly the heir to the throne had his own desire for Isabel's company. "I will not go." Isabel's voice quavered as she replied, but her face betrayed her resolution. The Maharaja smiled at her conviction. "I did not expect a different answer, but I could not have lived with myself if I had not made the offer. Perhaps after this is over you will consider once again being my guest." Major Dutton had endured enough of the opening flattery and gave Isabel no opportunity to reply. "Let us dispense with the pleasantries. What do you want?" The Maharaja's eyes were cold as he turned them onto the English major. "What I want, Major Dutton, is for you to leave my land. I will stand by the terms of the treaty my father signed, but I will no longer tolerate your presence in my kingdom." "I'm afraid that really isn't possible, sire." Proudfoot's oiled tones reclaimed the conversation. "You must become accustomed to the idea that we will rule here when you are gone." "And if I refuse?" "Then we will rule here now." The oil was gone from Proudfoot's voice. There was just steel. "In that case, we have nothing more to discuss." The Maharaja's face betrayed his anger. "I will allow an hour's truce for the removal of the wounded." 4 hours. Proudfoot smiled with false charm as he countered. 1 hour. My men will understand. The Maharaja's voice was as hard as the rock that littered his land. Proudfoot pouted and opened his mouth to carry on the negotiation, but the Maharaja raised a hand to silence him. "There is nothing more to say. You have 1 hour, and then you will die." Jack saw the hard glare in the Maharaja's eyes. He had seen this transformation before, the sudden switch from urbane gentleman to wolfish ruler. The Maharaja turned, showing his back to the British party. There was no more to be said. They had 1 hour. 1 hour to see to the wounded and prepare for the next assault. An assault they would have to repel. 1 hour until they would have to fight or die. Chapter 41. The defenders sat in an uneasy silence. The hour had passed swiftly, the time spent in rushed preparations. The tired men harried as they prepared to fight again. Ammunition had to be distributed, weapons cleaned and reloaded, and water had to be drawn from the well just outside the 24th's barracks. Wounds had to be dressed and the dying cared for. whilst all the while watching for the enemy to reappear. Jack had been forced to reduce the number of men stationed on the roof of the barracks to just 5, under the command of a corporal. It was not ideal, but the 24th had lost 9 men in the first assault, and there would be too few to defend the barracks if he left the original number to act as sharpshooters. He had retained his small flying squad, although this time he had vowed not to do anything as reckless as throw himself out of the window and into the middle of the enemy. "Why don't the buggers come and get it over with?" Private Jenkins asked the question that was on every redcoat's mind. The waiting played at their nerves, the fear scratching at them, an itch that could not be ignored. "Are you off somewhere special then, Private?" Jack had been peering out of the same window as the anxious redcoat. "I just want it over with, Mud. I mean, sir." "We all do." Jack unbuttoned his holster and made sure his sword was loose in its scabbard. The rest of his men were doing the same, fiddling with their kit as they went through the superstitious rituals that they believed might be the difference between life and death, each fearing the dreadful lottery they would soon have to face. "They are brave, aren't they now, those blue-coated buggers? They nearly got in here last time. For a moment I thought it was going to be like Chelina Walla all over again." "You were there?" "I was back. Bloody slaughtered we were. There were only 5 of us left standing in my company when it was over. Those Sikh boys fight damn hard." "Well, we stopped this lot once. We'll just have to do it again." "That we will, boyo." Jenkins had clearly forgotten he should be addressing Jack as an officer. They were just 2 redcoats standing, waiting for the enemy to appear. "No bloody heroics this time, though." Jenkins had been in the flying squad that had followed Jack on his foolish charge. "We're all getting too old for that kind of nonsense." "I can't promise." Jenkins shook his head despairingly. "Officers! They always know best, isn't that right, Buck? No matter how bloody foolish it may be." The crack of musket fire prevented Jack from replying. A salvo struck the side of the barracks, each bullet smacking into the stone with an ear-splitting crack. The redcoats came to life, flinching instinctively as the fusillade gouged thick crevices in the heavy stone. "Bloody hell!" Jenkins lost his shako as he ducked down behind the protective wall of mealie bags that blocked off the lower half of the window. "It's going to be like that now, is it?" Another salvo of musket fire cracked out. The second assault in the battle for Bundapur was about to begin. "Mark your targets!" Colour Sergeant Hughes snapped the order as the redcoats cowered from the steady fire. "Aim at the smoke!" The Maharajah's men had learnt from their first assault. This time there would be no wild charge. The musket fire coming from the windows and doorways of the buildings that lined the pathway leading away from the 24th's barracks drove the redcoats down behind their walls and barricades. Yet there was no precision to the enemy fire. There were no massed volleys, the gunmen shooting as they were ready, forcing the defenders to endure a constant barrage that sometimes died away before rising to a climax as 6 men fired at once. The cough of each gun sounded different. The redcoats under fire from a collection of weaponry ranging from ancient silver jezails to Brown Bess muskets that would have been at home on the field at Waterloo. As varied as the guns were, each was still capable of killing if its bullet found its mark, and the redcoats kept as low as they could behind the windows or stayed carefully to the side of the loopholes that dotted the wall closest to the enemy. "Commence firing!" Jack was taking a risk. He had been tempted to hold back, waiting for a charge, but he had seen the anxiety on the faces of the redcoats as he made them endure the withering fire. He had to let them reply, trusting them to be able to reload in time if an assault looked to be building. The muskets rang out almost in unison as the men's tense trigger fingers were finally released. The deeper cough of their percussion muskets drowned out the enemy fire. the effect of nearly 60 guns firing together creating a thunderclap of sound that echoed loudly in the confined barracks. "Reload! Look lively!" Jack urged. He peered through the window, screwing up his eyes at the inevitable cloud of powder smoke that billowed back to flood the room. He saw a couple of bodies slump to the ground as the 24th's fire found its target, but it was difficult to tell how effective it had been. Another smattering of bullets crashed into the barracks, gouging more holes in the already heavily pockmarked walls. It appeared the Maharajah's men were happy to stay out of sight and engage the 24th in a duel of musketry. It would be a long, tedious war of attrition, but it would pin the redcoats in place, the idea of abandoning the barracks simply unthinkable. A huge cheer sounded from outside. It was a feral roar, the sound of the mob screaming its hatred, the terrifying noise of warriors released to the charge. "Sir!" Corporal Jones summoned his officer. Jack bounded across the room, cursing aloud as an enemy bullet scorched past his ear and knocked a fist-sized lump of plaster from the scarred wall. "Sir, hundreds of the bastards!" Jack followed the corporal's pointing finger. The Maharajah had altered his plan of attack, using the hour-long truce to gather together all his remaining foot soldiers. They had been formed into a huge phalanx that was aimed like an enormous fist at the north wall. The Maharajah was gambling everything on a single massive assault, a sledgehammer blow that would smash a hole in the defenders' frail perimeter and create an opening for his precious lancers. Jack stared at the enemy's massed ranks and saw certain defeat. "Half the men with me. Colour Sergeant Hughes, keep the rest of the men at the windows and return fire." He snapped off his orders. His men responded calmly. Jack ran his eye over the Maharajah's assault, which was already charging towards the north wall. They seemed unstoppable, and the tips of the sepoys' muskets were wavering as they stared down the barrels of their weapons at the immense horde tearing towards them. "Fire!" Jack clearly heard Dutton's order before the roar of a massed volley crashed out. The Major had timed it to perfection. The enemy horde was no more than 50 yards from the barricade when the horror was unleashed. At such close range, the sepoys' muskets couldn't miss. The men leading the rush were struck down as if someone had suddenly lifted a rope to trip dozens of them at once. The musket balls tore into the packed formation, flaying the front ranks. The blood bright as bodies were torn and shredded. "Hold them!" Dutton's voice was huge in the shocked silence after the volley. His sepoys heard the cry, bracing to meet the wave of hatred that was coming for them. Every inch of the barricade was blocked, the sepoys standing shoulder to shoulder, their wicked bayonets reaching forward and presenting an unbroken front towards the enemy. Then the screaming began. The enemy, wounded, screamed, their voices rising in horror as their bodies were mangled and shredded by the well-timed volley. The living screamed as the shadow of death passed them by. The delight of living turned into a visceral shriek of hatred as they bounded past the ruined bodies of their fellows and used their sabres to hack at the men who had so nearly killed them. There was no time for the sepoys to reload. The enemy stepped past the dead and the dying, ignoring the cries for aid as they pressed home their attack. They came at the barricade in a rush, filling every part of the wall, the deep ranks of the mob driving those at the front forward, the power of the charge relentless. The sepoys stood their ground. They stabbed across the barricade, punching their bayonets into the bodies of the enemies. Time after time they rammed the weapons forward, twisting and recovering the blades before thrusting again, trying to hold back the tide of shrieking devils that swarmed around them. But there were simply too many men fighting against them. Sharpened spears reached across the barricade. The Maharajah had packed the leading ranks with the weapons, the longer reach of the spears allowing the attackers to stab at the sepoys whilst keeping away from the bayonets that the red-coated soldiers were using with such professionalism. All along the barricade, the redcoats fell. The long spears found their way past even the most determined defence, the vicious weapons driven deep into the sepoys' flesh. The enemy leapt forward as soon as a gap in the line appeared, swarming over the barricade before turning and unleashing their talwars at the nearest defenders. It was chaos. Dutton's men fought on, using the butts of their muskets as clubs, striking back at the enemy that now swarmed around them. They refused to be beaten, and here and there the enemy was driven back over the wall, the desperate defiance of the defenders sealing the gaps. Dutton charged at the head of his flying squad. They tore into the largest gap, the cough of the Major's revolver loud enough to be heard even above the noise of the violent struggle. The charge drove deep into a pack of the Maharajah's soldiers that had breached the wall, the sepoys flowing past their commander to ram their bayonets forward, the disciplined charge sending a shudder through the enemy ranks. Yet too many holes had been torn in the defenders' perimeter. Even as Dutton's charge thrust a path into one gap, so another breach was made further down the line. The melee descended into swirling chaos, men fighting in desperation as they sought to kill or be killed. The shrieks of the living added to the screams of the dying to create a cacophony that belonged in hell itself. A trumpet blared, its rising call clear even over the shrieks of the men fighting for their lives. The Maharajah had waited for his moment. His lancers rode forward, their ranks ordered and precise. The trumpet called again, and the two lines of cavalry halted, dressing the ranks so that every spacing was in perfect order. The lances were lowered, each man crouching with the dreadful weapon tight under his right armpit, the vicious blade held still. The trumpet blared for the last time. The lancers kicked their mounts in unison, ordering them forward whilst keeping the line straight, the precision drilled into them by the countless hours of instruction they had endured in preparation for this moment. The horses lifted their heads, sensing the building excitement. Their riders were forced to pull hard on the reins to keep their mounts in check as they maintained the pace of the walk. The slow, steady movement would soon build into a trot, then a canter, before they were finally released to the madness of the gallop that would see them committed to the attack. The Maharajah rode at the lance's head, leading his beloved cavalry forward, taking the power of his own sword to fight against those who would strip his descendants of their right to rule. Chapter 42. Front rank! Kneel! Jack had formed his half-company into a double rank facing towards the north wall. He saw the desperate struggle around the perimeter, but he held his men back, certain that to commit them now would be to throw their lives away. Their barrack room was behind them, a final refuge should they be forced to retreat. The drumming vibrated through the ground. He had felt the dreadful noise before, and he knew what was coming. The trumpets sounded again. He had recognised the call. His body still reacted, the thrill of the rising note setting his nerves on edge. This time he was the target of the charge. "Stand firm, men." He saw the look of horror on his men's faces, their eyes wide as they watched the confused melee in front of them, their knuckles showing white as they held their weapons tight. The lancers were moving fast now. Jack could see glimpses of their beautiful blue jackets, and he felt a pang of pride at the disciplined order of their charge. The sepoys saw them too. In desperation they ran, fleeing the dreadful weapons that were held so still despite the wild motion of the galloping horses. The Maharajah's foot soldiers cut them down as they tried to escape, slashing their weapons forward before they too fled, scrambling away to the flanks lest their own cavalry ride them down. Jack watched as the surviving sepoys broke. They had fought hard, defying the terrible odds, holding the line when lesser men would have run, yet none could stand in the face of the lancers. Dutton roared as he fought. He stamped his right foot forward, driving his sword into the guts of one of the wild hillmen who had broken through the line. He twisted the blade, stepping backwards before backhanding it and beating aside the spear that had been thrust at his side. He punched the sword forward once more, snatching away the throat of the man who had tried to kill him. the whisper of blood flung wide by the blow. The press of men around him eased, the nearest enemy soldiers backing away before turning to run. Thank God! Dutton felt the surge of relief course through him. They had held. They had done the impossible. Back to the barricade! Well done, men! Well done! The Major's voice died away. His men were running. The enemy were clearing to the flanks, their faces twisted in fear as they fled. Dutton didn't understand. He looked at the remains of the wall he had ordered made. There was little left of it, the mealie bags and crates pushed aside or lying crushed and splintered where the enemy had broken through. Along its length was a carpet of bodies, the bright red of the sepoys' jackets spread thickly amidst the corpses of the enemy. The ground vibrated under his feet, a deep, resonant thunder that reverberated through his exhausted body. Dutton looked up, and for the first time he saw the blue line that surged towards him. The Lancers charged the barricade. Their horses leapt over the remains of the obstacle, their riders swaying in the saddle as they adjusted their weight to absorb the landing. They swept on without pause, their lances twitching as they calmly picked their first targets. They hit the running men with an audible slap. The screams of the dying were shut off as their bodies fell under the galloping horses, the heavy hooves crushing away any last vestige of life. The Lancers' line broke as they charged into the fleeing sepoys, the riders yanking at the reins as they sought more targets for their blood-splattered lances. The sepoys were slaughtered as they ran, the merciless Lancers spurring hard to ride down any that survived. "Front rank! Fire!" Jack roared the order as soon as he saw the left flank of the Lancers' line break through the thin screen of scattered sepoys. "Reload!" He watched in grim satisfaction as the nearest Lancers fell to the first volley, the musket balls slamming cruelly into the flesh of horse and rider, the fire indiscriminate. "Rear rank! Present!" He counted the seconds in his head. He knew it would take his men around 20 seconds to reload, and he had to hold back the rear rank's volley to make sure the redcoats kept up a regular fire on the swarming Lancers. He waited, his icy calm reassuring his command, who watched in horror as the enemy Lancers butchered the remains of Dutton's fortress. The seconds crawled by. The front rank rushed to reload their muskets, but to Jack it seemed as if time had frozen. He saw an unseated Lancer scramble to his feet, his hands reaching for the sabre belted around his waist. He stared at the man, recognizing him from the long hours spent drilling with the Lancers. He saw sadness on the man's face as he watched his mount drumming its hooves into the ground in agony, its body swathed in a sheet of red blood from the dreadful wound in its chest. The Lancer turned, his face twisted in hatred, his sword lifting as he charged towards the 24th, determined to carry on the fight, to take his sabre against the men who had killed the horse he had loved. "Fire!" The second rank's volley crashed out. Jack gripped and re-gripped the handle of his sword as he began the long, slow count for a second time. The unseated Lancer was gone, his remains lying no more than 10 paces from the thrashing body of his mount, his rage and desire for revenge obliterated by the musket ball that had torn his body apart. "Dutton!" Through the powder smoke, Jack saw the Major staggering backwards. His hat was gone and a river of blood ran from a dreadful wound to his scalp. Jack was close enough to see the blood that stained the sabre in Dutton's hand. The Major turned, his face twisted into a grimace of horror. Jack held his stare. He could see the pain in the older officer's face, the dreadful shock at the Lancer's charge clear in his wide, vacant eyes. A Lancer rode Dutton down. The long lance was driven through the Major's back with such force that the tip emerged from his chest in a gory fountain of blood. Dutton fell instantly, his body thrown like a rag doll to lie face down in the dirt. "Front rank! Fire!" Jack ordered the next volley despite the shudder that ran through him as he watched his fellow officer die. He was acting like an automaton, the commands coming unbidden to his lips as he handled the power of the 24th's brutal volleys with familiarity, a craftsman using his tools. The lancer who had struck Dutton down turned as the volley thundered out. He didn't flinch as the bullets whispered past, but pulled hard at his horse's reins, his free right hand reaching for the jewel-encrusted sabre at his waist now that his lance was stuck fast in Dutton's body. The need to fight driving him, the urge to kill all-consuming. Jack recognised the rider. The Maharajah of Sawad had not shirked the fight. Jack stared as the Maharajah rammed his spurs hard into his mount's side, the enemy leader's mouth wide open as he summoned his rider to greater efforts. Jack tore his eyes away. There was no time for regret. He stalked along his thin line, walking from flank to flank, prowling behind his men, counting off the seconds until the next volley, the steady rate of fire the only thing that could save them from the same bloody fate as Dutton and his men. The lancers ploughed across the parade square. The open area that had seemed such a boon to the defenders was now transformed into a killing ground. A handful of sepoys still ran for their lives, the terrified fugitives scattering to the wind as they tried to escape the dreadful lances. None made it more than 50 yards. Red-coated bodies lay dotted in every direction. A few still lived, twisting and writhing on the ground in agony, the wounds inflicted by the razor-sharp lance tips horrific. Most lay still, in the unnatural, twisted poses of death, victims of the dreadful skill of the disciplined lancers. Jack heard the trumpet blare. The Maharajah's voice roared as he ordered his men to reform, reasserting control over the lancers who had ridden to such bloody success, for the battle was not yet finished. The Maharajah reined in, coming to a halt directly opposite the 24th's thin line. The lancers began to assemble around him, the ordered lines rebuilding after the careering gallop in pursuit of the fleeing sepoys. Jack pushed through his men. "Reload." He gave the order quietly as he walked to stand in front of the line, directly in the Maharajah's path. As he did so, he watched the Maharajah. He saw the rueful smile on the man's face, the slow shake of the head as the ruler realised that the Englishman he had allowed to live was standing in his way. Yet there was coldness in the brown eyes now, a despair that Jack had not seen before. He withdrew his revolver, taking it into his left hand, his tulwar ready in his right. As he watched, the smile left the Maharajah's face. It was replaced by the dispassionate expression of a killer. Behind him, the outnumbered redcoats stood in silence. In front of them, the lancers aligned their ranks so that their charge would bear down on their red-coated opponents who waited so patiently to meet them. The defiant British soldiers were the final obstacle between the Maharajah and success. It would take one last charge, one last bloodletting, and he would claim the victory that could save his kingdom. The trumpet blared. The 3 notes were clear, the even call echoing in the silence that had fallen over the blood-soaked battlefield. It was the call to charge, the challenge to the cavalry to rake back their spurs and commit to the final madness. And it came from the British. The 1st Bengal Irregular Cavalry responded to the call to charge, the tide of bright yellow jackets flowing quickly into the wide expanse of open ground. With teeth bared, the dark faces beneath the golden headgear opened their mouths to scream their challenge aloud, the thrill of combat driving them forwards. A red-coated officer led the charge. Even from a distance, Jack had recognised the man who had become his enemy. Fenris held his sabre raised above his head as he thundered towards the Maharajah's cavalry. The British tore into the flank of the stationary lancers. They scythed through the ordered ranks, cutting the blue-coated men down before they could react. The right-hand side of the Maharajah's formation was gutted in moments, the British irregular cavalrymen ripping it to shreds. The lancers broke. The easy victory was snatched away, the final charge against the stubborn redcoats forgotten as they pulled at their reins and urged their tired mounts to turn and make a dash for safety. The Bengal cavalry went after them, cutting down any too slow to escape their brutal assault. Some lancers broke free from the vicious melee. Jack saw the Maharajah bent low over his saddle, surrounded by a group of his men who were thrusting their lances at the yellow-coated cavalrymen, selling their own lives in a desperate bid to give their ruler the chance to escape. "Stay here!" He shouted the order as he ran, leaving his astonished command to watch as he dashed towards the heart of the melee. It was time to find a horse. The animal pulled away from Jack's approach. Its nostrils flared wide in distress, but it had been trained well, and it only shied away before again standing still close to the torn body of its fallen master. Jack murmured as he approached, using the words he had learnt under Prince Abhishek's tutelage, holding out his hand to the nervous animal. He trod carefully around the ruined body of the lancer. The poor man had been hit full in the face by a musket ball, and there was nothing but a nauseating, pulsating mass where his head had once been. The animal whinnied, something in Jack's manner reassuring, the soft words soothing its fear. It shivered as the unfamiliar touch ran over its flanks, but it stayed still long enough for Jack to launch himself into the saddle. He slipped his feet into the stirrups, the familiar feeling of being astride a horse rushing through him. He pulled gently on the reins, turning the animal's head around before kicking it into motion. He rode after the Maharajah. Chapter 43. Prince Abhishek cursed. He stayed at his father's side, urging his tired horse to keep pace with the Maharajah's escort, even as the British cavalry tore through the men behind him. He dropped his bloodied lance and tugged his talwar from its scabbard, knowing the long reach of the lance would count against him in the vicious melee of hand-to-hand fighting. The small group broke free and rode for the sharply sided valley that still bore the churned-up, blood-stained soil of the previous day's fighting. They rode for their lives, staying close to one another as they raced away. Yet their horses were already tired, the long ride from the citadel followed by the charge against Dutton's sepoys draining much of their strength. There would be no easy escape. Abhishek glanced over his shoulder and saw the throng of horsemen riding after them. They were led by one of the red-coated devils who had plagued his father's lands for decades. Abhishek knew then what he had to do. His father had to escape. He was the only man capable of binding the kingdom's wounds and finding a way to secure some sort of future under the oppressive authority of the foreign queen. He reined in hard, slowing his mount and yanking its head round so that he faced his pursuers. The Maharajah and his remaining lancers did not notice his sudden manoeuvre and raced on, their horses labouring to keep them from the relentless pursuit. Abhishek threw his head back, calling to his gods, daring them to bear witness to his death. He thrust his spurs into his mount's sides, making it rear on its haunches before it gathered its last strength, and once again strained its aching sinews as it accelerated. Prince Abhishek, heir to the kingdom of Sawad, was riding to meet his death. He screamed as he charged, roaring his challenge to the gods he had summoned. He closed on the pursuing riders, urging his tired mount into the gallop, feeling the joy of the charge for the second time that day. But this time, he knew he would die. He roared as he slashed his blade at the first figure that rushed past him, his arm jarring as the sharp edge caught the man's ribcage. The blow knocked the rider from the saddle, his chest sliced open by the single strike, the red stain of blood bright against the gaudy yellow of his jacket. Abhishek was turning even before the man had hit the ground. He backhanded his weapon, using the sharpened rear to strike at a second rider, slicing across the man's face to leave a nauseating flap of skin hanging as he scored a deep wound through his features. The pursuers were turning now, wheeling round to counter the madman who had charged into their midst. "He's mine!" Abhishek heard the red-coated officer bellow at his men, but he was in no mood to listen. He rose high in the stirrups, urging his horse to leap forward, timing the movement perfectly, punching the tip of his tulwar into the spine of the nearest enemy rider. He twisted the blade as soon as he felt it catch the man's backbone, releasing the weapon from the clutches of his flesh. He had enough time to recover the blade before the red-coated officer came at him. Their blades met, the vicious contact jarring both men's arms. Neither flinched. They hacked at each other, using their knees to control their mounts as they twisted round. Their swords slashed and parried, yet neither could penetrate the other man's defences. They bellowed as they fought, grunting with the force of the blows, howling in frustration as they failed to land the telling attack. Parry followed parry, the strikes coming in quick succession, both men fighting with desperate skill as they battled to cut the other down. Jack heard the sound of fighting before he could see what was happening. He had urged his mount on, feeling the tremors in his horse's body as he drove it past the point of exhaustion, cruel in his mastery. He saw Prince Abhishek engaging Lieutenant Fenris, unable to do anything but spur the flagging animal onwards as the two men fought their desperate duel. He was still 100 yards away when he heard Fenris shriek in victory. The British officer deflected the prince's sword wide, finally beating aside the man's defences. He rammed his sabre forward, punching the tip into the prince's body, and bellowed in victory as he felt the sword slide into the younger man's guts, the resistance of the flesh giving way against the vicious blow. Fenris leant forward, pushing all his weight behind his sword, twisting the blade so that it churned in his opponent's stomach, the blood pumping from the dreadful wound to run hot and sticky over his hand. He saw the shock on the prince's face, the searing agony reaching the young man's eyes. "Die, you bastard!" Fenris eased his weight forward so his face was inches from the dying prince's. Vicious in his victory, he spat out the words, his spittle flying to fleck his enemy's face. "I won." Abhishek's eyes glazed over, the prince's face betraying his youth as he approached death. "You lost." Fenris gave his blade a final twist before he pulled the sword out, swaying backwards to avoid the body that toppled from the saddle. The boy hit the ground face first. The Maharajah's son and heir, the Raj Kumar, was dead. "Ride them down." Fenris snarled the order. The men from the 1st Bengal Cavalry had watched in horror as the British officer cursed the Maharajah's son. Now they gathered their reins, exchanging looks with their fellows, disgust mirrored on every face. "Ride, damn you!" Fenris turned his horse in a tight circle, sneering into the faces of the men who surrounded him. "Ride!" The habit of obedience ran deep. The Risaldar who led the riders barked his own orders, throwing his reins forward and spurring his horse away. His men followed, happy to be away from the vicious officer who fought with such disdain. "Fenris!" Lieutenant Fenris started at hearing his name. He had thought to take the body of the young prince back to Proudfoot, claiming the reward he knew would be his for removing the only male heir to the throne of Sawad. He saw a rider hurtling towards him, and he felt the hatred flare deep in his veins. It appeared he was being given the chance to bring back 2 bodies. He smiled as he recognized the opportunity that was being presented to him. He would add the body of the charlatan to that of the foreign prince. "Hello, Arthur," Jack called out in greeting before slipping from the saddle as his horse came to a halt. Fenris turned, a twisted smile on his face. Good timing. You can help me with this corpse." Jack looked down at the body of the prince. He thought of the times he had cursed the Maharajah's son, damning the prince for the long, hard hours he had endured as he learnt to ride. He recalled, too, the jealousy he had felt when he understood the young man's desire for Isabel. Now he studied the blood-stained corpse lying face down in the dust and tried to feel nothing, to deny the emotion that surged through him. "Put the dirty beggar back on his horse, would you, old chap?" Fenris stood still as he gave the order, using his sabre to point to the pathetic remains of the Raj Kumar of Suad. Jack saw the calculating look on Fenris's face. He noticed the sword still held low in his right hand, dripping with Abhishek's blood. He looked into Fenris's eyes and saw death. "You killed him. You do it." He turned his back on the lieutenant, making as if to walk back to his own horse. He heard the scrabble of feet on the dusty soil and turned just as Fenris launched himself forward, his sword flung in a wide arc, the blow aimed at Jack's head. At the last moment, Fenris twisted his wrist, angling the sword down so that it was aimed at the joint of neck and shoulder, the sudden change in direction almost quicker than the eye could detect. But Jack was faster. His talwar cut through the air as he lifted it into position to parry the attack he had sensed was coming. He flicked his wrist as the weapons came together, turning his rising blade so that Fenris's sword sliced along its edge, the cowardly attack blocked and battered away. In a heartbeat he went after Fenris. He punched the talwar forward, ready for the inevitable parry, already switching his weight so that he could bring his blade round, slicing it at the red-coated officer's side. He followed the attack with another, flowing through the movements, his mind watching from afar as Fenris was forced to back away, his sword only just managing to beat aside the series of blows. They came so fast that the lieutenant was given no time to counterattack, and Jack smiled as he fought, feeling the speed coursing through him. Fenris was panting with exertion, sweat slicking his dark hair to his forehead. For the first time, Jack saw panic reach his opponent's eyes, the terror building as he felt the presence of death looming at his shoulder. In desperation, Fenris gambled. He stumbled backwards, moving quickly away from the dreadful talwar that came at him at such speed. The tip of the blade scored across his chest, splitting open the fabric of his scarlet coat. Yet it failed to touch his skin, and the manoeuvre gave him space, his gambit leaving Jack's defences open. The moment Jack's sword went wide, Fenris flung himself forward, driving the tip of his sabre at his opponent's guts. He had risked his life to launch the attack, and he howled in joy as he saw the blade slip into Jack's stomach. Jack felt the prick of steel against his flesh. He flung his sword at Fenris's blade, his calm detachment disappearing in a moment of wild panic. The talwar keened as it whipped through the air, driven by every ounce of strength that Jack possessed. Fenris's howl of victory turned into a bitter shriek of frustration as Jack's sword punched his blade to one side before he had time to drive it home. Jack sensed the madness blazing through him. He could feel the ooze of blood on his stomach, the bright pain of the wound flashing across his skull. A feral roar escaped his lips as the wild emotion wrestled away the last of his self-control, the delirium of battle filling every fibre of his being. He threw himself forward, battering his talwar at the red-coated officer who had come so close to killing him. He let the madness have its head, hacking at Fenris, who was forced to scramble backwards, his sword trying desperately to beat aside the dreadful series of attacks. Fenris screamed as the first blow pierced his defences. The talwar sliced into his side, gouging a thick crevasse in his flesh. Blood poured from the wound, flowing down his body to stain his white breeches. Another attack followed, knocking his sabre from his hand, the last of his defences torn away. As the fight ebbed from his body, he lifted his arms, shielding his face in a pathetic gesture of utter defeat. Don't kill me, please. I beg you." The strength left his legs, and he fell heavily onto his backside. "Don't kill me." He sobbed the words, waving his arms in front of his face as if he could ward off the killing blow he knew was coming. He tried to shuffle backwards, his arms scrabbling at the rocky ground in a desperate bid to flee, the blood pulsing from his wound, leaving a gory smear on the ground. Jack advanced after the man he had defeated. The madness of the battle still roared in his ears, and he braced his arm, ready to thrust the talwar forward, any thought of mercy driven from his mind. "Stop!" The command came from behind him. It was a voice of authority, but it would not stay his hand. He took a pace forward, ready to kill the pathetic creature begging for his life at his feet. The crack of a revolver echoed loudly in the confines of the valley. The heavy ball crashed into the rock in front of Jack, the whine of the ricochet whistling past his ears. "I said stop!" The sound of the revolver's chamber rotating reached Jack's ringing ears. He considered ramming home his sword regardless, the bitter desire to finish the worm that crawled on the ground in front of him almost too strong to resist. "Jack Lark, I order you to stop!" Jack felt the rage leave him. He lowered his sword and turned his back on Fenris, leaving the beaten man to sob in relief as he realized he had been spared. Major Proudfoot smiled, smug satisfaction writ large on his face. "Thank you, Jack." The revolver was still in his hand, a thin trail of smoke leaving the barrel. "I am genuinely sorry that I have to do this, but it really is for the best." He smiled at Jack before he pulled the trigger. Chapter 44. Jack flinched as the revolver fired, every muscle tensing as he anticipated the impact of the bullet. The sound of the shot echoed in his head, but he felt nothing. He glanced over his shoulder and saw Fenris's body lying on the ground, blood pooling around his twisted corpse. The man who had come to hate Jack was dead, shot through the heart by a single bullet. Proudfoot laughed. "Not you, Jack." He threw his head back and laughed at the sky. "You should see your face." Jack tried to swallow and found he couldn't. He felt his body trembling, the shadow of death walking across his soul. "Why?" His voice cracked as he forced out the question. "Because he was a party to all this. I wanted to finish it." Jack spat out a thick wad of phlegm, making everything neater. "Something akin to that." Proudfoot was urbane in his reply. "So you are executioner as well as judge and jury?" Proudfoot laughed at Jack's bitterness. He plucked at the sleeve of his scarlet uniform. "I'm a redcoat. Isn't that what we do? Besides, had I not interrupted you, I rather fancy you might have killed him yourself. I wanted that honour." "So, you got your war." Jack spat again, the words souring his mouth. "And we gave you your victory. I hope you think it was worth the cost." "The cost?" There was a trace of fire in Proudfoot's voice now. "I would say that for bringing a whole kingdom under the company's control, it was a veritable bargain." "You bastard." Proudfoot frowned, as if chewing on something unpalatable. "I wouldn't quite put it like that." His face cleared, the joy of his success still too fresh to be soured by Jack's condemnation. "But I have to thank you. I rather think we might have lost, had it not been for you." Jack shuddered. It was akin to being thanked by the devil. He had done what he had believed to be his duty. The notion that he had been nothing more than Proudfoot's pawn shamed him. Proudfoot saw the look on his face. Now, there is no need to be so modest. You are a killer, Jack. That is what you do. I saw you fight. You have a talent for it. Besides, I suspect you enjoy it. The words hit home. Jack shivered as he remembered the thrill of the battle, the soul-rending madness that had overwhelmed him. A part of him savoured the memory. Proudfoot had summed it up best. He wore a red coat. Killing was his trade. I must ask you to do one last thing for me. Proudfoot absent-mindedly toyed with his revolver. Jack heard the gentle grind as the chamber moved around to bring a fresh cartridge under the hammer. What? Jack felt the chill of fear. Run! Proudfoot chuckled at the look of surprise on Jack's face. Come now, Jack. With Dutton and Fenris dead, you are the last man alive who knows all that has happened. Besides, you're a murderer. Didn't I just witness you kill Lieutenant Fenris in cold blood? Added to your other crimes, there really is no other option. But I owe you a debt for what you did today, so I will allow you to try to escape. He lifted his arm, aiming the revolver at Jack's heart. Run, Jack, run. Jack's mind raced. He was tempted to stay his ground, to let Proudfoot administer a solution to his despair. He thought of Isabel, of the dreams he had foolishly allowed to grow. Her words before the final battle haunted him. She did not deserve to live with the constant fear of discovery, with only a killer to turn to for love. She deserved much more than he could give her. He thought, too, of Lakshmi, sensing the emotions she had awakened. Despite everything he had endured, he felt the will to live like a knot in his belly. He was a charlatan, an impostor, a thief, and a killer. He would never submit meekly to his fate. Proudfoot barked with laughter as he read the play of emotions on Jack's face. You are a fool, man. Did you ever truly imagine a future with that girl? Would she really give up everything for you? You are cursed, Jack Lark. I believe you will come to a very sorry end. Jack shivered, the echo of the tiger's curse in Proudfoot's verdict. He looked up into the Major's eyes. He saw nothing but death. So he ran. The ground was treacherous, the scree slope uneven and scattered with rocks lying ready to trip the unwary. Jack lurched into motion, his movements clumsy. He made it no more than 6 paces before he stumbled, his ankle twisting on the uncertain footing. He went sprawling, any last shred of dignity gone. Proudfoot cackled wildly. Run! He screamed the single command, his voice rising in pitch as he laughed at the sight of the proud charlatan scrabbling on the ground in his desperation to get away. Proudfoot feared the impostor. He had watched in awe as the man fought, terrified by the brutality as he hacked at the enemy. To reduce such a man, such a killer, to nothing more than a floundering fool desperate for life was as great a victory as the one he had won over the Maharajah of Sawad. He raised his revolver, aiming squarely at the back of the man who was trying so frantically to escape. He had had his amusement. It was time to end the charade. Jack sucked in a last breath, filling his lungs with the scorching air. He nearly choked on the dust his fall had kicked up, but he forced himself to still his quivering muscles. He slipped his hand across the front of his body, hiding the movement from Proudfoot. He heard the man's laughter, but ignored it, refusing to let the flare of anger overwhelm him. He had to be in control. He closed his eyes, summoning the calm he would need. The holster was unbuckled, and Jack slipped his revolver free. In one motion he scrabbled to his feet and brought his arm around. He saw the look of surprise on Proudfoot's face as the barrel of the revolver appeared, heard his laughter cut off abruptly as the man he had believed to be fleeing for his life turned to fight. Jack felt the tension of the trigger underneath his finger. He had seen too much death that day, enough to stain his soul for a lifetime. Yet he did not hesitate as Proudfoot's terror-stricken face filled the simple sight at the end of the barrel. He pulled the trigger. The blast of the revolver was loud. Jack walked forward, emerging from the inevitable cloud of powder smoke, keeping the weapon pointed at the man who had been the cause of so much death. He fired again, the action instinctive, the second bullet following within a heartbeat of the first. The echo of the twin shots reverberated around the high ground before silence once again reclaimed the deserted, lonely hillside. Jack's aim had been true. Proudfoot lay spread-eagled on the ground, striking as dramatic a pose in death as he had in life. Blood pooled around his body, which twitched as the last vestige of life escaped. Jack watched until at last Proudfoot lay still. The devil had taken another soul. Jack stood over Proudfoot's body. The first bullet had hit the major in the chest, killing him instantly. The second had taken off the political officer's shoulder, the heavy bullet tearing a grotesque hole in what had been living flesh. The grey pallor of death had already laid claim to Proudfoot's face, his last dreadful look of horror now fixed forever. Jack felt no remorse at having killed a fellow countryman. The man had deserved to die. He turned and savoured the peace. He was quite alone, only dead men for company. Proudfoot's words settled in his heart, the echo of the tiger's curse hardening like lead in his soul. He knew then that he was destined to be alone, to be the killer everyone expected him to be. It was time to leave. He worked quickly. It did not take long to drag the two corpses to the horse that would carry them. Lifting them took more effort, but the lancer's horse was well trained and stood still, even as its nostrils flared at the sweet tang of the blood that still poured from the dead bodies. With an effort, Jack draped the bloody corpses across the saddle, using the long stirrups to bind them in place. He pulled himself into the saddle of Proudfoot's sable mare, keeping a firm grip on the lead rope of the horse he had taken from the field of battle. He did not look at the body of the man he had just killed, and that he had now left behind for the vultures and the dozens of other animals that would relish a feast on such fresh flesh. He eased the mare's head around, turning his back on Bundapur. With a click of his tongue and a gentle nudge of his heels, he eased the horse into motion, settling down into the slow walk that would take him up the steep side of the valley and away from the scene of so much death. The tower stood silently as Jack approached, watching his progress with serene indifference. The last moments of the long ride brought back memories. He saw again the place where the tiger and his men had ambushed the picnic party. He recognized the spot where he had fought the black-robed bandit leader, a shiver running down his spine as he felt again the presence of death at his shoulder. The village was empty. The few who had survived the tiger's ravaging horde had abandoned the place that had become a graveyard for their greed and their futile ambition. Jack rode along the dusty paths alone, only breaking the silence to click his tongue to urge on the pair of tiring horses, which strove to do his bidding despite their exhaustion. The white-robed priest watched him approach. The man was old, his dark face creased and wrinkled with the passage of time. At his side was a boy. The youngster could not have been more than 7 years old, the body under the simple langotti just sinew and bone. The priest laid a protective hand on the shoulder of his new apprentice before ushering him forward to help the white-faced stranger who had brought his dead to the tower. Jack helped the boy with Fenris's body, his nose wrinkling in distaste at the stench of dead flesh. Together they dragged the corpse to the door of the tower, the officer's heels leaving twin trails in the sandy soil. The white-robed priest did not say a word as the man walked away. Yet he stared for a long time at the back of the tall, lean officer with the hard grey eyes before he turned to the orphan boy he had found hiding in the rubble of his grandfather's house. His days of goat herding ended with the slaughter of his meagre herd and the massacre of his family. The British officer did not turn back. Chapter 45. Jack had seen the Lancers long before they spotted him. They rode towards him slowly. He waited for them patiently. He knew there was every chance that they would take one look at the white-faced man in the blue Lancer's uniform and kill him out of hand. But still he sat and waited, the blood-stained talwar left in its scabbard. The Lancers came close. There were 8 of them. All were old men whom he did not know from his time in the fortress. But he recognized the man who led them. "He should have listened." Jack spoke loudly as the Lancers approached, his bitter words the only greeting he would give. Count Pyotr Wysocki said nothing. He halted his escort and contemplated the weary rider in front of him. He finally broke the silence. "He is a proud man. He did what he thought was right. We cannot judge him." Jack clenched his jaw, biting off his anger. "Were you there?" The Count shook his head. "I was left behind." Jack heard the acid in the words. The former commander of the Maharajah's Lancers had remained in the fortress with the rest of the old men and the boys too young to fight, the only ones not trusted in battle. Now the party of decrepit Lancers was the sole force the beaten Maharajah could muster, the ancient warriors forced back in the saddle to do their master's bidding once more. "Yet you stayed." Count Pyotr nodded, his face grave. "Yes, I stayed. I'd started to think my time here was done. Now I think it has just begun." He looked Jack hard in the eyes. "'Tis a strange thing, loyalty, is it not, Jack? It binds us to our fate, no matter how much we like to think we can choose." Jack thought on the Count's words. His own notion of loyalty had bound him to the British. It had led him to forsake the Maharajah, to fight against the man who had saved him. In the aftermath of the battle, Proudfoot had claimed that he had made the difference, that his actions had been decisive in handing the British their victory. The notion shamed him. "He will listen to you now." Jack forced himself to speak, to not dwell on the emotions the Count was stirring. He was no longer certain where his loyalty lay, what path his future would take. "He will. He has no one else. The rest have forsaken him. They have abandoned the palace, taking anything of value. Only Lakshmi remains. He has lost everything." Jack turned in the saddle. He looked at the pathetic corpse draped over the saddle of the horse he had taken from the field of battle. The Maharajah had paid a high price for his ambition. "I would take him his son." The Count kept his eyes on Jack's. Then he nodded, acquiescing to the request. Nothing more was said as the Lancers formed up behind their former general, taking position around the body that Jack had brought out of the bloody carnage. Their brooding silence wrapped around him. He gave no command, but walked his horse forwards, knowing they would follow. The Taragar looked deserted. Jack led his escort up the long, sloping ramp towards the heavily protected gates. This time there was no traffic, no carts jostling and pushing as they were forced to wait for entry. The gates were open and unguarded. The mighty fortress of the Maharajahs of Sawad had finally been overcome, not through siege or escalade, but by the complete defeat of the army that defended the walls and guarded its gates. A single rider rode to greet them. At first Jack thought it was a boy, the only one left to greet the remnants of the lancers who had ridden from the same fortress with such hope and pride just days before. He halted the lancers, letting the rider approach. It was only as it got closer that Jack recognised the slim figure, the face that had once beguiled him now grey and stricken with grief and fear. Lakshmi's eyes searched his face, as if trying to find something she had lost. Jack watched as she looked past him, and saw the body he had come to deliver. Her eyes betrayed nothing, yet he saw the tears as she pulled at the reins, turning away from the man who had come to destroy any lingering hope in her heart. He followed her, entering the Star Fort for the last time. "You are a brave man, General Lark, or a foolish one." Jack turned as he recognised the voice. He had been standing in the room of the Ramayana paintings. He had walked the familiar corridors of the palace, the memories of his life there haunting him. The place was deserted, the fabulous decorations intact but somehow now faded, as if life itself had fled. He had found himself in his favourite place, his feet taking him there without conscious thought. He had thought to rest, his battered body begging for some respite. He was still wrapped in the grime of the battlefield, the blood of his enemies mixed with that he himself had shed. He had hidden the filth under the dusty blue uniform he had retrieved from its hiding place, and now he faced the Maharajah dressed in the trappings of the life he had forsaken. "It was my duty." Jack's own voice was cold. The Maharajah said nothing. He stared at Jack for a long time. Neither flinched from the scrutiny of the other. Jack saw the pain etched into the king's face, the grey pallor of grief stealing the vibrancy from his face. He looked as empty as his palace, his vitality swamped by the bitterness of defeat. "Thank you." When the Maharajah spoke, it was barely even in a whisper. "Thank you for returning my son to me. He needed to be brought home. I was honoured to escort him." There was little sympathy in Jack's voice. There had been too much death for him to feel pity. The Maharajah cupped his hand over his eyes. Jack could see the shudders that racked his body. When the hand fell away, he saw an old man. "You and the Count were right. You English do not accept defeat." The words were spoken without emotion, the Maharajah's eyes blank. "You must do as they tell you now. You will be treated well." The Maharajah waved the words away. "Nothing matters anymore." "Of course it matters." Jack's voice was brittle, but it was sharp too. "Your people need you more than ever. You led them to this place. You cannot forsake them now." The Maharajah looked as if he had been slapped. "Do not dare to tell me my duty." He was vibrating with emotion, his face stricken with a mixture of grief and despair. "I dare tell you, for it must be said." Jack spoke without hesitation, the voice of an officer to a subordinate. "You chose to go to war. Now you must deal with the peace you have forced on your people." He let his hand fall to the hilt of his sword. His fingers brushed the sharkskin grip. It was mottled now, stained with blood and with sweat. It was no longer the pristine weapon of a prince. It was the bloody tool of a killer. The blade rasped as he pulled it from the scabbard, the noise loud in the quiet of the room. The balance of the weapon was still perfect, and Jack held it in his hand, feeling the power of the beautiful steel. He reached across with his left hand and took hold of the blade. The edge was notched and pitted, the marks of combat etched deep. He had done his best to clean it, but flecks of blood were still stuck in the swirling script that decorated the Talwars' faces, the residue of men's lives embedded in the steel. He hefted the sword, then turned the blade, offering it hilt first to the Maharajah. "This is yours." The Maharajah said nothing. He looked at the sword. His hand twitched, the fingers reacting instinctively to take the grip, then went still. He looked at Jack, fixing him with a stare that contained a spark of his former power. "No, I have no need of a sword any more. The days of fighting are done. It's yours, and yours alone." He stood back, taking a step away from the man he had once sheltered. "You are right to chastise me." He looked at Jack for a long time without speaking. "I think perhaps I underestimated you, Jack Lark." Perhaps. Jack had endured enough of kings. He felt the urge to leave, to get away from men with ambition. He suddenly felt foolish, standing holding out his sword in some theatrical gesture. He reversed the blade and thrust it back into its scabbard, a flicker of anger forcing away the sadness that had engulfed him since he had first seen Lakshmi riding towards him. "Perhaps." The Maharajah repeated the word softly. Then his face hardened. "I will do as you say. I must lead my people, even though my heart is broken, and my country will be swallowed by you monstrous British." "You must. The time for resistance is over. A new agent will come. He will treat you better than Proudfoot. He will ask you to sign another treaty, one that will let us rule here. Your time is done." Jack had nothing more to say. Too many men had died for him to feel sympathy, their lives sacrificed at the altar of the Maharajah's pride and Proudfoot's ambition. He took a step back, preparing to leave the Maharajah for the last time. "Where will you go?" The Maharajah stopped him before turning and sitting heavily in a gilded chair that faced the window. "I don't know." "What of Miss Young Summers?" Jack bridled at the sudden flurry of questions. "She has no need of me. She needs a good man, not a killer." He remembered Isabel's face as she addressed the wound to his arm. He had seen her fear, her tiredness. He could not stay in her life. She deserved more. "Perhaps you are both." The Maharajah looked past Jack. He was staring at the small courtyard outside the window. The ornate fountain at its heart was silent, the water that gave it life gone. Jack looked at the man who had once been king. "No, I am one, and one alone." He said nothing more. He left the Maharajah to stare into nothingness and walked away. Epilogue. The loud voices of the hawkers and the boldest stallholders called to the tall sahib who rode through the packed streets, each begging for his attention with their fantastical promises and unsubtle suggestions. The rider studiously ignored the entreaties, pushing away the bewildering array of objects that were thrust towards him. It made for slow progress along the narrow, paved streets that wound their way through the city like a maze. But the rider did not care. He was in no hurry. He watched a group of small boys playing at marbles as he rode by, their playground a gutter full of filth. The boys were naked, save for golden cords around their necks and the gold and silver bangles on their wrists and ankles. One gleeful boy was clapping another hard on the back, the downcast expression on the second boy's face telling all who had won and who had lost. The crowd of at least 30 other boys were cheering at the tops of their lungs, the loud shouts of "Koob, Koob" drowning out even the most enthusiastic merchants. The rider edged his horse around a filthy fakir who sat plumb in the middle of the narrow street, holding his palm aloft to display the scruffy tree growing through the centre of his hand. The manoeuvre took him close to the next stalls, and he was immediately besieged by eager merchants keen to have him part with his money. Yet something in the white-faced rider's face deterred even the most avaricious stallholder from pressing too close, the beautifully decorated tulwar that hung at his hip too well used to be worn solely for decoration. Authoritarian voices bellowed for attention, and the rider edged his horse into a gap between the stalls as a palki pushed through the crowd. The curtains were pulled together, but there was enough of a gap for the rider to snatch a glimpse of a doe-eyed beauty reclining on scarlet cushions, the vision of loveliness disappearing quickly as her bearers jogged past. He eased his horse back into the throng, taking care to steer a wide path around a group of hard-faced men mounted on sturdy mountain ponies, doing his best to ignore the appraising gazes that ran over him. This was no place for a fight, but still his hand crept to the holstered revolver at his hip, his fingers deftly undoing the buckle that held the flap in place. The gesture did not go unnoticed by the men from the hills. They saw too the anger in the eyes that flashed over them, and they let the stranger past. The crowd thinned out as the loud calls from the minarets echoed through the tightly packed streets, the faithful called away to prayer. The rider hesitated, as if suddenly unsure of where he was headed, before he pulled off the street and passed through an intricately carved doorway and into an empty courtyard. The place was an oasis after the jostling crowds of the thoroughfare. A marble fountain tinkled gently, the sound of moving water calming and cooling after the bedlam of the street. The syces leapt to their feet as the rider eased himself wearily from the saddle, the young boys undoing the straps that held his belongings on his horse's back before his feet had even hit the ground. "Welcome, Sahib, welcome!" The owner of the hotel came bustling out from a room that overlooked the courtyard, hastily brushing the flakes of pastry from his white robes as he advanced on the tired rider. "You have chosen a fine establishment for your stay." Something in the rider's flat stare made the owner pause, but he was too eager for the coins in the man's saddlebags to remain silent for long. "Yes, Sahib, this is a fine hotel. I shall give you the best rooms, yes, the very best room." He clapped his hands, shooing the young boys into the whitewashed corridor that led into the interior of the hotel. "Now, Sahib, let me prepare you some refreshment. I have the very best Bass's beer, just what you need to clear the dust from your throat. Yes, that's the very thing." More servants were sent running from the courtyard as the owner bowed at the waist and ushered the tall visitor into the shady interior of the hotel. "This way, Sahib, this way." The grey-eyed rider let himself be shown inside, the marble floors and white walls beautifully cool after the heat of the late morning sun. "May I ask your name, Sahib?" The tall man stopped and turned to face the owner, fixing him with a penetrating gaze. He let the silence stretch out, causing much hand-wringing from the anxious hotel owner, who wondered what offence the simple inquiry had caused. At last he spoke. "My name is Fenris." The man was curt, his voice clipped. "Lieutenant Arthur Fenris." You have been listening to The Maharajah's General by Paul Fraser Collard, read by Dudley Hinton. Text copyright Paul Fraser Collard, 2013. Production copyright Headline Digital, 2013. This has been a Headline Digital production, produced by Fox Yason Music Productions for Headline Digital.